The Riviera Gambit by Anthony Darder, Chapter 1. The heat in Cairo didn't just sit on the skin, it pressed down like a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone, unrefined gasoline, and the dust of a city that had been baking since dawn. McCall was currently behind a mahogany veneer desk, watching the plaster ceiling disintegrate. Every time the heavy caliber fire from the corridor chewed into the drywall, the room showered him in white, chalky debris. His tuxedo was already a casualty, the left sleeve hung by a single thread, and the fine wool was stained dark with sweat and grease. He reached into his waistband, checked the action of his Luger, and exhaled. 3, he muttered to himself. He didn't wait for them to breach. He exploded from behind the desk, a blur of motion in the dim light. The first guard, a burly man in an ill-fitting suit, barely had time to register the movement before Dash slammed the heel of his palm into the man's nose, pivoting off him to deliver a sharp, concussive kick to the second man's knee. The room became a cacophony of breaking wood and muffled grunts. Dash didn't trade punches. He traded momentum. He used the chaos, grabbing a heavy brass desk lamp and hurling it toward the far wall. The glass shattered, drawing every eye in the room to the corner. In that fraction of a second, Dash was already moving. His weapon barked twice, sharp, rhythmic snaps that cut through the shouting. He reached the main safe, but it was already locked down. No time. He shoved a volatile chemical charge, a little gift from Gizmo, into the seams of the door. He didn't even turn to watch. He vaulted over the inner railing, hit the stairwell, and dove for the landing as the room behind him turned white. The blast was more than just a sound. It was a physical blow that traveled through the floorboards and rattled his teeth. The shockwave stripped the wallpaper from the hallway, and the ceiling began to groan in protest. Dash didn't look back at the inferno. He was already sprinting down the service stairs, his boots thundering on the iron grating. He hit the alleyway, the humid night air slamming into him like a cold drink. His chest heaved. Behind him, the ministry building was beginning to exhale its own destruction. Glass showered the pavement like diamonds. He didn't run like a man who was afraid. He ran like a man who was late for an appointment. He slid behind the wheel of the Peugeot, the engine catching with a desperate, metallic cough. As he roared away, the ministry's upper floor surrendered to the fire, turning the night sky into a jagged orange mosaic. Dash drove through the debris, a ghost slipping out of the wreckage before the world even realized it was gone. Dash quickly dove into an awaiting plane and took off into the night, leaving the burning city behind him. After a few stops for fuel and some time with the many ladies he knew around the world, he flew back to District 9. District 9 was the headquarters of the agency that Dash had been working for several years. An imposing structure that, from the outside, looked like a cave. Once inside, if you could get inside, it was an underground city. The silence inside the facility was heavy, broken only by the hum of the ventilation and the distant rhythmic ticking of a cooling fan. It was a world away from the dust of Egypt. Here, the limestone walls were cool and smooth, illuminated by the soft amber glow of recessed lamps that made the underground complex feel less like a bunker and more like a private club. V stood by the main console, his back to the door. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his shoulders squared as if he were still wearing a uniform. He didn't turn when Dash entered, but the air in the room seemed to go thin. Dash walked in, shedding the remainder of his ruined tuxedo jacket. He looked like he'd been dragged through the desert, but his grin was still razor sharp. "You're going to be happy to hear the ledger is neutralized, V." V turned slowly. He didn't raise his voice, but the sharpness in his tone cut deeper than any shout. Neutralized? Is that the word you're using for a 3-block radius of rubble? Dash wiped his forehead, leaving a smudge of soot across his brow. I had to improvise. The guards were already at the safe door. You were there to shadow, not to incinerate, V said, walking over to the desk. He poured a measure of scotch into a crystal glass. Every intelligence agency in the hemisphere is currently looking for the man who turned the ministry into a furnace. You have effectively made Section 9 the most scrutinized organization on the planet. I got the film, didn't I? Dash tossed the lead-lined canister onto the glass. It hit with a heavy final sound. V looked at the canister, then back at Dash. The older man's face was a mask of cold, weary discipline. You have the film, but you've lost the mission. Cairo's a graveyard now, and we can't go back. You are to stay here, McCall. You will help Gizmo sort through his inventory, and you will stay out of the field until I am certain you've remembered that a gentleman's primary weapon is his shadow, not his matchbook. I'm a bit too old to play lab assistant, V, Dash said, leaning against the walnut desk, his posture relaxed despite the exhaustion etched into his face. V set his glass down. The sound was quiet, but it commanded the room. Then consider it a lesson in patience. You are done for the month. Don't test me, Dash. We are a needle, not a hammer. Learn the difference, or don't bother coming out of your quarters at all. Dash looked at the limestone walls, then back at V. He didn't argue. He knew that look. The look of a man who had seen enough war to know exactly when someone was becoming a liability. Understood, V. I'll go see what kind of toys Gizmo has cooked up to keep me busy. See that you do, V said, already turning back to his files. And try to leave the lab in one piece. The lab was less a workshop and more a temple to controlled chaos. It sat in the deepest, coldest belly of the complex, a cavernous space where the hum of high-voltage generators competed with the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a dozen intricate mechanisms working in unison. Copper coils hung from the ceiling like webs, and the scent of ozone, sharper, cleaner than the ruin he'd left in Cairo, stung the back of Dash's throat. At the center of it all stood Gizmo. He looked like a man who hadn't seen the sun in a decade, wearing a grease-stained apron over a white lab coat that had been scorched, bleached, and chemically eaten in equal measure. His hair was a chaotic halo of white fuzz, standing on end as if he'd spent the morning wrestling a lightning bolt. McCall, Gizmo chirped, not bothering to look up from the workbench. He was hunched over a dismantled cigarette case, his fingers dancing with the dexterity of a concert pianist. I heard about the ministry, truly inspired and a bit loud perhaps, but the structural integrity of the collapse? Magnificent. You really hit the load-bearing pillar dead center, didn't you? Dash leaned against a workbench covered in discarded brass gears and vials of volatile liquids, crossing his arms. V is less impressed with the architecture than you are, Gizmo. V lacks imagination, Gizmo dismissed with a wave of a jeweler's screwdriver. He looked up, his eyes wide and feverish behind thick Coke bottle glasses. A manic grin stretched across his face. But while you were busy being grounded, I was busy being productive. Come here, look at this. He cleared a space on the table, sweeping aside a handful of tiny springs. He pushed forward a fountain pen, sleek, silver, and utterly unremarkable. It's a fountain pen, Dash said, unimpressed. It is a pressurized delivery system, Gizmo corrected, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The ink reservoir is replaced by a concentrated mixture of synthetic paralytic agent. 1 click, a fine mist at 6 feet. 2 clicks, a high-velocity jet at 20. It won't kill them, but it'll make them wish they were dead for about 4 hours, and the best part? He tapped the clip. A micro-transmitter the size of a pinhead. You leave it on a target, I can track their location anywhere in the hotel within a 3-mile radius. Dash picked it up, weighing it in his hand. It felt balanced. And the radio? Hidden in the heel of your left shoe, Gizmo replied, bouncing on his toes like a caffeinated schoolboy. Wait until you see the cigarette lighter. It's an incendiary device, of course. but I've calibrated the fuse for a 5-second delay. Just enough time to toss it and watch the show. I know how much you enjoy a grand finale. Gizmo moved toward a wall of glass cabinets, his movements jerky and frantic. I've been waiting for a reason to field test these, Dash. V wants you to be a shadow? Fine. Let's make sure that when you move, you leave the entire world behind you. I've even been working on a tuxedo fabric treated with a reflective polymer. It won't make you invisible, but in a dimly lit casino, it'll blur your silhouette just enough to make a guard doubt his own eyes. He pulled out a heavy leather-bound case and laid it open. Inside were a series of miniature tools, lockpicks carved from tempered steel, and a small, delicate device for lifting high-end jewelry settings. I'm not a thief, Gizmo, Dash said, though a slow smirk spread across his face as he picked up a pair of needle-nose pliers. You're an agent, Gizmo corrected, his voice turning uncharacteristically serious for a split second. And in the world you're about to walk into, the difference is only a matter of perspective. Now, stop hovering and help me calibrate this receiver. We have a Riviera contact to prepare for, and I suspect the Duchess won't be fooled by anything less than perfection. Dash looked at the piles of gear, the strange, humming machines, and the wild-eyed man who seemed to view the world as one giant, intricate puzzle waiting to be solved. For the first time since he'd been sent down to the caves, the cabin fever began to lift. All right, Gizmo, Dash said, setting the fountain pen into his pocket. Let's see what you've got. Gizmo's face lit up, his expression shifting from scholarly intensity to a wide, manic grin. He reached for a heavy metal box on the top shelf, bringing it down with a reverent thud. He flipped the latch, revealing rows of cartridges that gleamed with a dull, matte finish. The bullets are filled with high explosives, Gizmo chirped, his voice vibrating with excitement. A proprietary blend. Anyone hit with one of these little bastards will be turned to a fine pink mist. No autopsy, no forensics, just vapor. The thought of it was clearly intoxicating. Gizmo began a little jig, his white coat flapping around him as he pivoted on his heels. Dash leaned against the workbench, watching the display with a mix of amusement and genuine concern. You're a sick man, Giz. I know, Gizmo responded, beaming with the pride of an artist whose masterpiece had finally been appreciated. Suddenly, the heavy pneumatic doors at the entrance of the lab hissed and slid open. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of these polished Oxfords on the stone floor silenced the room instantly. Gizmo went rigid, his hands darting behind his back to hide the explosive cartridges. V walked toward them with the measured pace of a man who owned the very air he breathed. He didn't spare a glance at the surrounding chaos of the lab. He stepped up to the bench, his gloved hand placing a thick manila envelope onto the surface with a precise, flat sound. McCall, V said, his eyes locking onto Dash. There was no trace of the earlier irritation, only a cold, focused urgency. I've changed my mind about your grounding. Dash pushed off the bench, his posture shifting instantly. The playful smirk vanished. An emergency? A disaster in the making, V replied. There is a Swedish spy in the French Riviera. She is currently negotiating the sale of a microfilm containing the names of every CIA operative currently in Moscow. If she succeeds, the lives of dozens of American men and women are as good as forfeit. V's gaze sharpened, cutting straight through the tension in the room. I need you to retrieve that film. You are to intercept her before the exchange. Dash reached out, thumbing the seal of the envelope. I assume you want it done quietly? V leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative rasp. Remember your manners, Dash. You are supposed to be a gentleman, not a demolition expert. And please, try not to blow up the city. I enjoy going there for the holidays. V turned on his heel, his shadow stretching long against the limestone as he walked back toward the door. Gizmo. Ensure he has everything he needs. and keep the explosives in the box until we absolutely require them. As the doors hissed shut behind V, Dash looked down at the envelope. He pulled out a black and white photograph of a woman with sharp, aristocratic features and cold, piercing eyes. Ingrid Valberg, Dash murmured. Gizmo leaned in, his glasses magnifying his curious wide eyes. Ah, the Duchess. She's clever, Dash. They say she's never left a footprint in any country she's visited. Dash tucked the photo into his pocket, his thumb brushing the cool metal of the fountain pen Gizmo had given him earlier. Everyone leaves a footprint, Giz. Some of us just make them harder to follow. Chapter 2, the lab hummed with the electric tension of final preparations. Gizmo was a whirlwind of manic energy, packing a slim, leather-bound attaché case with the precision of a master thief. He didn't just pack tools, he curated a lifestyle. Silk shirts, Dash. The best money can buy, Gizmo muttered, sliding the case across the workbench. And the cufflinks, the ones I showed you, they're synced to your watch. If you're ever in a bind, a simple tap on the glass will trigger a high-frequency pulse that'll fry any standard surveillance equipment within 10 feet. It's elegant, really. No sparks, no explosions. Dash checked the weight of the fountain pen, tucking it securely into his breast pocket. He looked around the lab, his expression hardening as he prepared to shed the skin of the hammer and step into the role of a man of leisure. He turned to the workbench and gathered the documents V had provided in the envelope, the dossier on Ingrid Valberg, and the mission parameters. I have the gear, Giz, Dash said, looking toward the heavy pneumatic doors. But there's one thing still missing. He walked out of the lab and straight into V's office. V was standing by the console, staring at the monitors that tracked the movements of Section 9 agents across the globe. He didn't turn, but his posture was rigid. I'm going as Richard Stone, an art dealer with more money than sense, Dash said, skipping the pleasantries. I'm supposed to be buying up the Riviera's finest history. I can't exactly check into the Hotel de Paris with a threadbare wallet. I need a bankroll, something that would make a tax inspector shit his pants. If I'm going to look the part, I need the funds to back it up. V's jaw tightened. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a thick leather checkbook and a stack of bearer bonds. He held them out, his eyes icy and lingering on Dash's face with a visceral warning. This is not a blank check to finance your own recklessness, V said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rasp. You lose this microfilm, or you draw more attention than your cover allows. And don't bother coming back to the States. I will not be the one to tell the director why his list of operatives was sold for a bottle of champagne and a pyrotechnic display. You are a collector, McCall, not a demolition expert. Dash took the funds, his smirk returning. I'm a fucking gentleman, V. I'll handle it. One last thing, V added, his gaze piercing. Once you arrive, you are to go to the Café du Port overlooking the harbor. You will meet an Austrian contact named Hans Warner. He knows the local terrain better than anyone. He has a personal stake in this. His sister is one of the names on that film. He will be expecting you. He provides the intel. You provide the muscle. The flight to Nice was a blur of high-altitude clouds and the droning of radial engines. Dash spent the hours shedding the habits of a field agent. He practiced the voice of Richard Stone, softer, more pedantic, focused on the brushstrokes of a Renaissance masterpiece rather than the pressure sensitivity of a detonator. When he wasn't flirting with the stewardess, when he stepped onto the tarmac, the Mediterranean heat slammed into him, scented with salt and pine. He didn't walk like a man who had just crawled out of a limestone bunker. He walked like a man who spent his afternoons in auction houses. He found the cafe by the harbor just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. Hans Warner was there, hunched over a black coffee, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's restlessness. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, a man held together by nerves and a singular, jagged purpose. Dash approached the table and took the seat opposite him. Mr. Warner, I believe you're expecting Richard Stone. Warner didn't look up immediately. He kept his eyes on the harbor, his posture tense. You're late. I prefer to be fashionably so, Dash replied, his tone perfectly calibrated to the bored, cultured cadence of the art dealer. I've always found that the most interesting things in the Riviera only happen once the sun goes down. Warner leaned in, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his cup. I don't care about your style, Stone. My sister's on that film. She went to America to build a life after the war. And if that girl's exposed because some fucking Swedish opportunist bitch wants a payday, I will personally see to it that you never leave the Riviera. Dash looked at the man. The fear, the desperation, and the raw protective rage. It wasn't the agency's politics. It was blood. The Duchess won't get the chance to sell, Dash said, his voice dropping to a soft, dangerous calm that wasn't part of the Richard Stone persona. Now tell me where she's keeping herself, and don't leave out a single detail. Hans took a sip of his coffee, then quietly sat down the cup. The Duchess is staying at the Casino de Royale, Hans said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper as he leaned over his cooling coffee. The auction is set to be held in the ballroom in 3 days. My guess is she has attached the microfilm to the back of a painting. But it wouldn't be a famous painting, or one that would draw much attention. Some of this art was stolen by the Nazis during the war. It could be a family portrait, one that wouldn't spark interest from most art buyers. But the Russian? He will be very interested in it. Who is this Russian? Dash asked, his tone still maintaining the measured, slightly bored inflection of Richard Stone. Victor Potosky, Hans replied, his jaw tightening. A big, ugly fuck that works for the KGB. Dash kept his face neutral, the practiced mask of an art dealer barely wavering. He took a sip of his sparkling water, the ice clinking softly against the glass. Potosky, Dash repeated, letting the name roll off his tongue with the mild, academic curiosity of a man discussing a provenance he hadn't yet memorized. I've heard the name in auction circles, not for his taste in oils, but for his aggressive acquisition style. Hans sneered, a jagged sound that drew a fleeting glance from a passing waiter. He doesn't care for art. He cares for leverage. If he gets that microfilm, he won't just have a list of names. He'll have the power to dismantle entire networks before they know they're compromised. My sister's life is at the top of that list. Dash leaned back, his eyes scanning the opulent, shimmering lights of the harbor. He was already mentally mapping the interior of the Casino de Royale. He knew the building. He knew the kind of people who frequented it. Men who traded secrets as easily as they traded shares. And women who hid daggers behind diamond-encrusted smiles. A family portrait, Dash mused, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. Unassuming, morose, something that looks like it belongs in an attic rather than a gallery. That's clever. It hides in plain sight, protected by the very thing that makes it worthless to anyone else, its lack of pedigree. She's counting on the experts being too arrogant to look at the trash in the corner, Hans added, his voice low and vibrating with tension. Potosky isn't an expert, but he's thorough. He's going to inspect every frame, every canvas, until he finds it. Dash stood up, leaving a crisp bill on the table. The Richard Stone persona slipped into place like a well-oiled machine, arrogant, unhurried, and impeccably dressed. 3 days is a long time to keep a target in your sights, Hans, Dash said, adjusting his cuffs. Keep a close watch on the casino's service entrance. If the Duchess or her Russian shadow makes a move, I want to know about it before they're even in their car. And what will you be doing? Hans asked, his eyes narrow and suspicious. Dash turned toward the sparkling lights of the casino, a faint, razor-sharp smile playing on his lips. I'm going to go try my luck at the tables, Hans. I think it's high time Richard Stone made the acquaintance of the Duchess. After all, what's an art auction without a little spirited bidding? Hans shook his head. V told me about you. Watch yourself. This is a beautiful city, don't blow it up. Dash didn't say a word. He walked towards the Casino de Royale. The Casino de Royale was a symphony of velvet, crystal, and desperate ambition. Dash navigated the floor with the confident stride of a man who had already spent his inheritance and didn't mind starting on his second fortune. He exchanged a thick stack of high-denomination markers for his chips, his eyes cataloging the floor layout. 2 service exits within 30 feet, a balcony overlooking the gardens, and a heavy security presence near the private high-stakes rooms. He chose a roulette table with a strategic sightline, tucked against a marble pillar that offered both a view of the main floor and a quick escape route. He dropped a single chip onto 14 black. The dealer, a man with a face like polished granite, set the wheel into its hypnotic, rhythmic blur. The ivory ball danced, clattered, and finally settled with a hollow thwack. Red 23, the dealer announced, sweeping the board clean. He looked at Dash with a practiced, sympathetic smile. So sorry, sir. Would you care to place another bet? Dash didn't blink. He reached into his stack and tossed 5 chips directly onto 14 black. The gesture was casual, almost dismissive, the hallmark of a man for whom money was simply a tool for entertainment. The wheel spun again. The ball seemed to bounce with a life of its own before finding its home. 14 black, the dealer droned. Dash raked in his winnings, his expression remaining perfectly bored. Beginner's luck, he remarked to the table at large, though his eyes had already drifted away from the green felt. It did not take much scanning. At a table across the room, surrounded by a crowd of drooling men, you could practically see the erections hidden within their pants, sat the Duchess. She was a vision of calculated elegance in a sparkling gold dress that shimmered like liquid sunlight. Blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and a figure that would put a Coke bottle to shame. She was a walking wet dream. She didn't just command the table. She occupied it. Around her, the men hovered with a pathetic gravitational pull, their eyes glazed with fixation. Ingrid Valberg scanned the room, not with curiosity, but with the detached appraisal of a hunter looking for a weakness in the walls. Dash leaned back against the pillar, his hand drifting to his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the cool metallic casing of the fountain pen. She was exactly as advertised, a walking, breathing danger wrapped in gold. He didn't approach her, not yet. He simply watched, letting the atmosphere of the room settle around him. If he was going to play Richard Stone, he needed to make sure the Duchess saw him not as a threat, but as a potential mark, or better yet, a fellow player. Dash gathered his winnings, his movements fluid and unhurried. He let the stack of heavy chips clink together, a sound that in a place like the Royale spoke louder than any introduction. As he drifted through the crowd, he made a detour toward the bank of slot machines lining the periphery, a stark contrast to the high-stakes tables nearby. He didn't bother checking the reels. He simply reached out, hooked his fingers around the heavy iron lever, and gave it a sharp, decisive yank. The mechanism groaned and settled, and before Dash even turned his head, the machine erupted. Bells screamed in a frantic metallic melody, and coins began to cascade into the tray with a deafening rhythmic clatter. It was a chaotic, garish intrusion on the refined atmosphere of the casino, and precisely what he needed. In Monte Carlo, brilliance could be faked, but the sudden, loud declaration of a winning hand was a universal language. It screamed that he was a man the house was currently paying to stay. He didn't even look at the machine. He let the coins pile up, uncollected, and instead let his gaze drift across the floor. The noise had the intended effect. Across the room, the collective pulse of the Duchess's entourage flickered. For a split second, Ingrid's head turned, her icy blue eyes tracking the source of the clamor. She caught sight of Dash, standing nonchalant in his impeccably tailored suit, a man who seemed more amused by the jackpot then impressed by it. She studied him for a heartbeat, her gaze cool and analytical, before dismissing the distraction and turning back to the baccarat table. Dash allowed a thin, satisfied smile to touch his lips. He hadn't just announced his presence. He had established his status. He was a man with money, and more importantly, a man who didn't care about the small change. He left the clattering machine behind, the jackpot still ringing in his ears, and began the slow, calculated walk toward her table. He hadn't just announced his presence. He had established his status. He was a man with money, and more importantly, a man who didn't care about the small change. It was time to see if the Duchess was as sharp as her reputation, or if she was just another player waiting to be cleaned out. Chapter 3. Dash didn't just walk to the table. He glided, his posture radiating the relaxed, slightly tipsy confidence of a man who had more money than sense and was looking for a way to burn it. As he reached the baccarat table, the drooling men parted, sensing an intruder who wasn't intimidated by the private status of the game. He didn't wait for an invitation. He leaned against the velvet-covered rail, his shoulder inches from the Duchess, and watched the dealer flip a card. He didn't look at her with the hungry, glassy-eyed intensity of the other men. He looked at her with the mild, analytical boredom of a man inspecting a painting he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. The dealer dealt the next round. Ingrid stared at her cards, her expression a cool, impenetrable mask. Dash watched the game play out, then let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, as if the entire display were slightly beneath his notice. "You're playing for the thrill, not the money, aren't you?" Dash said, his voice smooth and carrying that distinct, pedantic cadence of Richard Stone. He gestured vaguely toward the mountain of chips sitting in front of her. Most people here are terrified of losing. They treat these markers like they're pieces of their own soul. You look like you're waiting for the ship to sink just to see if you can swim. The table went quiet. The entourage shifted, a few of the men shooting daggers at Dash for the interruption. Ingrid slowly turned her head, her icy blue eyes locked onto his, searching for the tell, the nervousness, the greed, the fawning adoration. She found none of it. She found only the bored, lingering gaze of a man who had seen everything the world had to offer and found most of it tiresome. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her lips. Not a warm smile, but the sharp, calculated curve of a blade. "And what would a man like you know about sinking ships, Mr.—" She let the sentence hang, testing him. "Stone," he supplied, bowing his head slightly. "Richard Stone. And as for the ships, Duchess, I find that in this part of the world, if you aren't prepared to swim, you really shouldn't be on the water at all." He gestured to the dealer, his hand moving with a practiced, elegant flair. "I'll stake the next hand. If the lady loses, I cover her bet. If she wins, I donate the winnings to the bar tab. I'm quite bored with my own money today, and I'm curious to see if your luck is as sharp as your taste in attire." Ingrid's gaze didn't leave his. She tapped her fingers on the felt, the diamonds on her rings flashing under the chandelier. The atmosphere at the table shifted, and the men weren't just hovering anymore. They were watching, breathless, sensing that something far more interesting than a card game was about to happen. "A bold offer, Mr. Stone," she murmured, her voice like silk over crushed glass. "But are you sure you can afford the consequences of my winning?" "From the looks of things, I'm not worried," Dash said, his voice dropping into that lazy, dismissive drawl that made him sound entirely harmless. He tapped a finger against the felt, looking not at her, but at the cards currently sliding across the table. Ingrid didn't blink. The tension in the air was palpable, a live wire vibrating between them. "What brings you here, Mr. Stone?" she asked. Her voice was a smooth, calculated probe, designed to find the fault line in his story. "I'm in town for the art auction," Dash said, not missing a beat. He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, as if the entire collection of the casino was just another room he'd walked through. "I deal in acquiring fine art and antiquities for collectors in the States. The duds? They get donated to museums. Good for the tax write-off, better for the reputation. Ingrid tilted her head, her gaze lingering on his face as if she were trying to read the provenance stamped on his soul. With the price of art these days, how can you afford to donate any to a museum, Mr. Stone? Or are you just exceptionally good at spending other people's money? Dash chuckled, the sound devoid of any real tension. He flashed that easy, crooked grin, the signature of a man who didn't know what a budget was. The clients I work for can more than make up for any losses. Besides, why settle for one masterpiece when you can buy the room? The dealer began to move, the cards sliding with rhythmic, mechanical precision. Silence descended on the baccarat table, the surrounding men holding their breath. The cards hit the felt with sharp snaps. Ingrid's hand hovered, her rings catching the chandelier light. She flipped her card. A sigh rippled through the onlookers as the outcome settled. The Duchess had won. She didn't show excitement. She showed only that sharp, predatory satisfaction. She looked up at Dash, the cards forgotten. "It seems you've lost your bet, Mr. Stone," she murmured, her eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and suspicion. "And I have just become slightly wealthier at your expense. How does that make you feel?" Dash leaned in, lowering his voice until it was just for her. "I feel like a man who just discovered that the most interesting prize in this room isn't on the table. It's holding the cards. If you're willing to take my money, perhaps you'd be willing to take a drink with me. I have a feeling you know exactly which paintings in this auction are worth the effort, and I'd hate to make a foolish investment." Ingrid swept her winnings toward her with a grace that bordered on rhythmic. She didn't look at the other men at the table. She looked at Dash, a faint, challenging amusement sparking in those icy eyes. "Very well, Mr. Stone," she murmured, standing with a fluidity that drew every eye in the casino. "You've provided the entertainment for the evening. It would be rude to refuse the drink." The bar was a cavern of mahogany and dim amber light, a stark contrast to the bright, desperate energy of the floor. They ordered matching martinis, the glass frosted and sweating in the Mediterranean heat. As they sat, Ingrid shifted seamlessly into the role of the refined expatriate. She spoke of a childhood in the quiet, pristine neighborhoods of Stockholm, describing the smell of pine and crisp Baltic air. She recounted her entry into art dealing as a series of fortunate accidents. A summer internship at a gallery in Gothenburg, a mentor who taught her to see the soul in a canvas, and the inevitable migration to the grand auction houses of Europe. It was a perfect story, polished, curated, and entirely hollow. Dash watched her, his expression a masterpiece of rapt, admiring interest. He nodded at the right moments, his eyes crinkling with feigned charm. He was the perfect audience for her performance. But beneath the mask, he was dissecting every sentence. Stockholm. That checked out. It was her cover origin. But the details about the gallery, the mentor, the specific auctions, it was all too clean, like a biography written by an agency handler. There were no messy human contradictions in her narrative, no mention of family, no slip-ups about struggle. She wasn't just lying, she was rehearsing. "You have a very singular way of looking at the world, Ingrid," Dash said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "Most people here see art as a balance sheet. You see it as a secret. I find that fascinating." Ingrid traced the rim of her glass, her gaze never wavering from his. "And you, Richard? You seem like a man who has built an entire life out of secrets. Or perhaps just a very expensive facade." The challenge was laid bare. She was watching his eyes, looking for the flicker of a shadow, the sudden tenseness of a man who realized he'd been caught. She was just as good as he was. She knew his story was as manufactured as her own, but she didn't call him out. Why would she? She was bored, and he was the most interesting piece of machinery in the room. "A facade is only as good as the audience it fools," Dash replied, leaning in until the scent of her perfume, something floral and dangerous, filled his senses. "I suppose that's why we're both here, isn't it? to see who puts on the better show. Ingrid laughed, a low melodic sound that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned back, crossing her legs, the gold of her dress catching the light. 3 days until the auction, Mr. Stone, she said, her voice a silk-wrapped threat. It's a very long time to spend with a man whose story is so impeccably crafted. Tell me, do you have any other talents, or is your entire personality just a well-oiled investment portfolio? I have a few hidden depths, Dash said, his smile razor-sharp. But I think we should leave those for the auction floor, don't you? They held each other's gaze. Two predators circling in a cage, each recognizing the other's teeth, but both agreeing for the moment to keep the hunt a game. I have a better idea, she said. My room is upstairs. If we are going to put on a show, let's do it in private. Her icy blue eyes danced with a hunger that was part lust and part predatory, like a lioness stalking a meal. As you said, 3 days is a long time. I think I will make you wait. Besides, I still have to book my room. It might have a more romantic view, Dash said, dropping the stone persona for a moment. This flirting, this cat and mouse, this was all McCall. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with an electricity that made the air in the bar feel almost solid. Ingrid didn't blink. She held his gaze, her expression shifting from the practiced, polished charm of the Duchess to something raw, predatory, and darkly amused. She sensed the tectonic shift in him. The moment the art dealer's polished veneer cracked to reveal the steel underneath. She let out a slow, deliberate breath, her lips curling into a smile that was less of an invitation and more of a dare. A tease, Mr. Stone? Most men would be scrambling for the elevator keys by now. Dash leaned back, his eyes dark and steady, shedding the pedantic art dealer cadence for something lower, more dangerous. The persona of Richard Stone hadn't vanished, but it had been shoved into the passenger seat. The man currently looking at her was Dash McCall, and he had spent his life navigating the razor's edge of attraction and assassination. Most men are looking for a trophy, Ingrid, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. I'm not in the business of collecting things I don't intend to keep, and I prefer my view to be entirely my own, not something assigned by a concierge. He stood up, his movements predatory and controlled, tossing a generous stack of bills onto the mahogany bar for the drinks. An act of careless wealth that still masked the lethal precision in his hands. I'll be at the hotel tonight, he continued, holding her eyes with a look that promised a much more interesting game than the one they'd played at the baccarat table. I have a feeling that by the time the auction arrives, we'll both be quite tired of pretending. But for now, I think I'll let you wonder if I'm as interesting as I seem. Ingrid watched him rise, her blue eyes tracing the line of his jaw, the subtle tension in his shoulders. She knew he was playing a part just as she was, but the friction between them was real, a volatile mixture of mutual suspicion and undeniable lethal magnetism. She remained at the bar, her hand lingering on her empty glass, watching his shadow stretch across the polished floor as he walked toward the lobby. She didn't look like a woman who had just been spurned. She looked like a hunter who had just realized her bait had started hunting back. As Dash reached the lobby, he didn't look back. His mind was already moving, stripping away the night's theater. He had the target's location, he had his foot in the door, and he had just successfully unsettled the most dangerous woman in the Riviera. He stepped out into the humid night air, the neon lights of the casino casting long, orange flickers against his face. He checked his watch. The one Gizmo had synced to his cufflinks. The timer was running. 3 days to the auction, 3 days to find the painting, and 3 days to make sure the Duchess didn't realize that the art dealer she was playing with was the man who was going to take everything she had. He pulled a cigarette from his case, lighting it with a flick of his silver lighter. The smoke curled into the night, thin and ghostly. Game on, Duchess, he whispered to the silence of the street. He didn't go to book his room. Not yet. He turned down a dark alleyway, his stride long and silent. It was time to contact Hans. It was time to figure out exactly which painting on that inventory list was hiding a death warrant. Chapter 4. The Richard Stone mask stayed on until the lobby doors swung shut behind him. In the quiet of the alley, Dash's posture shifted from the relaxed, tipsy confidence of the gambler to the silent, efficient movement of a man with a dangerous mission. He tapped a rhythmic signal on the rusted service door. A soft, deliberate cadence. Hans opened it, his face etched with the weariness of a long, anxious watch. He didn't speak, but his eyes tracked the street behind Dash before pulling him into the dim, claustrophobic air of the maintenance corridor. He locked the heavy door with a series of metallic clicks. "Updates?" Dash asked, his voice shedding the art dealer's pedantic, high society cadence and dropping into the low, gravelly register of a man who dealt in secrets. Hans moved to a scarred wooden table where facility floor plans were spread out under a flickering, yellowed lamp. "The auction house is finalizing the manifests. It's a mess, but I've got it. Everything high-value cataloged for the auction is being moved to the secondary secure holding room in the administrative wing tonight. It's entirely separate from the main casino vault." Dash leaned over the table, his mind calculating the path, the obstacles, and the timing. "The administrative wing. That confirms she's keeping the transaction strictly official until the gavel drops. She wants the provenance to look unimpeachable." "It's heavily guarded," Hans noted, his finger tracing the service corridor on the map. 2 men on constant rotation at the main gate, and the door itself is linked directly to the building's central security hub. Any unauthorized entry, or even a prolonged forced entry attempt, triggers an alarm that will bring the whole house down on you. Dash didn't look concerned. He looked energized. "I don't need unauthorized entry. I'm Richard Stone, a buyer with a high net worth interest in this specific collection. I'm going to request a private early viewing of the catalog pieces tomorrow. If I can get her to authorize a one-on-one session, I can get inside that holding room legitimately with the keys in my hand. And if she refuses, if she thinks you're just another nuisance," Hans asked. "She won't," Dash replied, his expression focused and cold. "She's an opportunist, and she thinks she has me pegged as a man with more money than sense. If I show enough interest and enough manufactured ego, she'll want to stroke that vanity by showing me the goods. I'll make sure the floor manager knows I'm unsatisfied with the public photos and demand a closer inspection. It's the oldest trick in the book. Make the target think they're gaining a client, not losing a prize." He looked at Hans, his eyes dark. "Just make sure your contact keeps an eye on the transport schedule from that holding room to the ballroom. If she agrees to the viewing, I need to know exactly when the piece is accessible and who is holding the watch." Dash turned back toward the door, his mind already shifting gears. He had the location, the motive, and the cover. Now he just had to manage the Duchess for 48 more hours. He needed to be Richard Stone long enough to get behind that door, and Dash McCall long enough to finish the job. Dash stepped into the room that V had booked for him, a clean, functional, and utterly forgettable space. He looked around, his mouth curling into a wry, dismissive line. It was the kind of room a low-level clerk stayed in to save on per diems, not the kind of room a man who claimed to buy masterpieces stayed in. If the Duchess or her people ran even a basic background check on Richard Stone, this room would be the first point of failure. He didn't unpack. He walked straight back to the elevator and returned to the lobby, his stride adopting the languid, slightly impatient rhythm of a man who found the world's offerings consistently underwhelming. At the front desk, he didn't lean in. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the clerk with the mild, expectant boredom of a man who had never heard the word no in his life. The clerk was busy filing a heavy ledger, the ink still wet on the entry. Dash tapped his gold signet ring against the marble counter once, twice, a sharp, rhythmic sound like a ticking clock that demanded attention. "I'm afraid there's been a clerical error," Dash said, his voice smooth, cultured, and just thick enough with disdain. "This current room, well, it feels more like a transit lounge for traveling salesmen. I'll be requiring your premier Sea View suite. And do see that the balcony is sufficient. I have a habit of taking my morning coffee while reviewing inventory, and I loathe being cramped. The clerk, startled by the intrusion and the sheer weight of Dash's aura, fumbled with a brass desk bell before sliding the heavy guest ledger toward him. Of course, Mr. Stone, right away. My deepest apologies. I shall have the bellhop move your trunks immediately. Moments later, Dash stood in the center of the hotel's finest suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the expanse of the dark, moonlit Mediterranean, and the room itself was a monument to gilded, excessive luxury. It was pretentious, overpriced, and perfectly suited for a man who claimed his clients were essentially his bankroll. He set his small leather-bound briefcase on the mahogany desk and looked out at the water, his reflection caught in the glass, the face of Richard Stone, looking entirely at home. Now, he murmured to the empty, opulent room, this is the room of a snobby art dealer. The morning started not with coffee on the balcony, but a call from V. What is this upcharge on the hotel room? V asked, his voice tight even through the receiver. Boss, I need to play the part, Dash answered, leaning against the window frame. I can't do that from a janitor's closet. The Duchess isn't going to invite a man staying in a shoebox to view her private collection. Did it have to be a suite? An expensive suite at that? V asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. It's very nice, V. You would love it. The view is spectacular, Dash answered with a light mocking chuckle. This is not a fucking joke, McCall, V screamed, something he rarely did. I'll give you this one to keep up the charade, but any more expenses outside what is necessary is coming out of your pay. Do you understand? Loud and clear, sir, Dash replied, his tone snapping to professional focus. V paused, calming himself with a ragged breath. Have you encountered the target? The Duchess? Yes, we've met. She's not in your bed, is she? V asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. Of course not. Who do you take me for? Dash asked, trying to sound as innocent as a schoolboy. I know exactly who you are, McCall. That's why I asked. Well, she's not, Dash said, his smile fading. Keep it that way, V said, the finality of the statement hanging in the air. That I can't promise, Dash said before the line went dead. Dash held the receiver for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a faint lopsided smile touching his lips. V was rattled. That was good. It meant the pressure was working on everyone. He hung up and walked to the balcony, the morning sun already turning the Mediterranean into a sheet of hammered gold. He took a slow breath of the salt, thick air. Keep it that way, V had warned. Dash looked down at the bustling hotel entrance 3 stories below. It was a nice sentiment, but V didn't understand the geography of this particular game. Ingrid wasn't just a mission objective to be isolated and neutralized. She was a predator, and she had already invited him into her circle. If he tried to keep his distance, he wouldn't be protecting the mission. He'd be outing himself as a fraud. He moved to the small table where he had laid out his gear. The cufflinks weren't just jewelry. They were his insurance. He checked the tiny internal mechanism one last time. The microscopic camera and the proximity transmitter were synced and ready. He didn't have time to worry about V's blood pressure. He had a reputation to maintain. He adjusted his silk tie in the mirror, letting the Richard Stone persona slide back into place. The imperious tilt of the chin, the bored, analytical glint in the eyes. He picked up his briefcase, the weight of it reassuring in his hand. He attended the public viewing as scheduled, but as he moved through the room, he made sure his dissatisfaction was visible. He lingered too long over the wrong pieces, sighed audibly, and eventually caught the eye of the floor manager, shaking his head with a look of profound aristocratic boredom. It's a tragedy, he remarked to the manager, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The provenance is decent, but the way these pieces are displayed, it's simply amateur. I expected far better from the Duchess's collection. If this is the extent of the quality on display, I'm afraid I'll have to withdraw my interest, unless, of course, there are items held back that weren't deemed suitable for the general public. I wish to see everything that is up for sale, Dash added, his tone sharpening with a hint of condescending indulgence. My clients often have peculiar tastes. They love the oddities as much as the masterpieces. If you're hiding the truly interesting work in the back, you're doing both your seller and your balance sheet a grave disservice. The floor manager, a man whose spine seemed permanently fused in a bow, looked visibly rattled. Mr. Stone, I assure you the catalog on display is... The catalog on display is precisely what I've seen, Dash interrupted, dismissively waving a hand toward the room. And it is, frankly, pedestrian. I've come a long way for something exceptional. If the Duchess is truly serious about this auction, she wouldn't leave her best items in a dark corner gathering dust, while wasting my time with these decorative trifles. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, yet still patronizing register. Now, be a good man and see what can be done. I have a private suite upstairs. If the Duchess or her representative wants to salvage a potential sale, they know where to find me. Otherwise, I'm afraid I shall have to spend my afternoon taking my business elsewhere. Dash turned on his heel, not waiting for a reply, and walked toward the ballroom exit. He knew the bait had been set. The mention of peculiar tastes and oddities would be relayed to the Duchess within the hour. She wouldn't be able to resist. Either her ego would force her to prove him wrong, or her greed would force her to bring the oddity, the target painting, to him to ensure the deal stayed on track. Dash hadn't been back in his room an hour when a sharp, authoritative knock came at the door. He quickly tidied his gear, ensuring the tactical transmitter was hidden inside the lining of his briefcase, and went to the door. When he opened it, the Duchess stood before him, looking even more radiant and lethal than she had at the bar. I heard you were not impressed with the works on display, she said, her voice like velvet over steel. That you wish to see everything. Dash stood in the doorway, his expression a perfect portrait of mild, weary annoyance that slowly melted into a look of polished, appreciative surprise. He held his glass of scotch loosely in his left hand, the amber liquid catching the light of the suite's chandelier. Your Highness, he said, his voice dropping into that familiar, silky register of Richard Stone. He bowed his head just enough to be respectful, but not enough to be subservient. I must apologize. I had no idea my criticisms were so swiftly carried to the only person whose opinion actually matters. He stepped back, gesturing with an open hand into the opulent room. Please, do come in. I was just lamenting the state of modern curation. It's a tragedy, really, how easily a fine piece can be ruined by a poor setting. The Duchess stepped inside, her presence immediately filling the space. She took in the room, the expensive appointments, the view of the sea, with the sharp, appraising eyes of a fellow predator. You are quite vocal for a buyer, Mr. Stone, she said, her tone smooth and dangerous, an invitation to a game they were both clearly playing. She stopped near the desk, her gaze lingering on the closed briefcase before drifting back to his eyes. Most men with your interest would simply keep their checkbook ready and their opinions to themselves. Dash chuckled softly, closing the door behind her with a definitive, soft click. Most men are looking for a centerpiece for their parlor, Duchess. I'm looking for the things that have a history, the things that are misunderstood. Your floor manager seems to think I'm looking for filler. I'm looking for character. He moved to the small bar, his movements relaxed and fluid. May I pour you something, or are you here to prove that I was wrong about what you have in the back? The Duchess didn't take the glass. She moved toward the window, the silk of her gown whispering against the carpet. She looked out at the dark horizon of the sea, her reflection appearing ghostly in the glass. You have a reputation for being difficult, Mr. Stone, she said, her voice cool, devoid of the social artifice she'd worn in the bar. But your critique today was observant. Most men are too distracted by the gilding to notice the cracks in the lacquer. Dash stood by the minibar, his posture relaxed, his eyes never leaving her. Gilding is for the tourists. I'm here for the substance. She turned, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. Is that so? Then let us test your eye. She walked toward the desk, her gaze darting to the heavy, locked briefcase. She didn't reach for it, but the implication was clear. She was sizing up his inventory. I have a piece, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. It was acquired from a private estate in Prague. It hasn't been cataloged. It hasn't been cleaned. It is, by all accounts, quite odd. Most would call it a ruin. I call it the only reason to hold this auction at all. Dash felt a shift in the room. This was the opening. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms, feigning a bored indulgence. Prague, you say? The market is flooded with Prague finds. Usually they're just late-century forgeries with a bit of dirt rubbed into the frame to convince the gullible. The Duchess stepped closer, invading his space, just enough to make the air feel charged. This is no forgery, but it is delicate. It requires a specific kind of appreciation. It is currently under heavy lock and key in the administrative wing, away from the prying eyes of the rabble who think they know value. Then show it to me, Dash said, his voice flat, demanding. If it's as exceptional as you claim, I'll stop wasting your time and start talking numbers. If it's another dusty disappointment, I'll be on the first flight to Nice tomorrow morning. The Duchess studied him, her eyes searching his face as if she were inspecting the brushstrokes of a painting. She reached out, her gloved fingers brushing the fabric of his sleeve, lingering just a second too long. You are a very impatient man, Richard. It makes me wonder what you are really rushing toward. She pulled back, her gaze dropping to his hands, strong, steady, and entirely too still. You have the hands of a man who likes to get his work done himself, not the hands of a man who waits for others to do the heavy lifting. Dash didn't blink. He kept his expression one of mild, aristocratic offense. I am a man who respects his own time, nothing more. Very well. She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the brass knob. Meet me at the administrative gate at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. I will have the manager unlock the secondary vault. You can examine the piece in private, but be warned, Mr. Stone, if you decide to waste my time, I assure you, you will find this hotel much harder to leave than it was to enter. She opened the door and turned back, her eyes glinting with a dangerous spark. Don't disappoint me. With that, she was gone. Dash remained in the silence of the suite, his heartbeat steady. He had the location, the time, and the invitation. But the look in her eyes, the way she had stared at his hands, suggested that while he had hooked the fish, she knew exactly what kind of bait he was using. Chapter 5. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows of the suite, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. Dash didn't relax. He couldn't. The thrill of the invitation was a cold weight in his gut, the kind that reminded him exactly how close he was to either a massive score or a shallow grave. He didn't touch the scotch again. Instead, he spent 2 hours meticulously prepping his gear. He tucked a thin, magnetized vibration sensor into the seam of his jacket, designed to detect the locking mechanism's tumblers, and verified that his cufflink camera was synced to the receiver in his briefcase. Once he was satisfied, he shifted. He stopped being the man prepping for a heist and became Richard Stone again. He smoothed his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and stepped out of the suite, slipping into the crowded, opulent hum of the hotel's public areas. He played the part of the bored, wealthy dilettante to perfection. He spent an hour in the casino, placing large, indifferent bets at the baccarat table, watching the cards with the detached air of a man who didn't care if he won or lost. All the while, his eyes were scanning the peripheral. He caught the reflection in a polished brass fixture. A man in a charcoal suit, one of the guards he'd seen on Hans's blueprints, leaning against a pillar near the entrance. He wasn't playing. He was watching. Dash made sure to offer a fleeting, dismissive glance in the man's direction before turning back to his cards, confirming the tale without ever letting the guard know he'd been spotted. As the sun began to dip, painting the lobby in hues of bruised purple and gold, Dash retreated to the hotel's private terrace garden. He wanted a cigarette, a moment of genuine solitude to clear his head. He walked past the manicured hedges and stone fountains, the smell of jasmine heavy in the cooling air. That was when he saw her. The Duchess was sitting alone at a wrought iron table near the cliff's edge, a glass of dark red wine held loosely in her hand. She wasn't holding court, and she wasn't surrounded by the usual sycophants. She was staring out at the Mediterranean, her profile sharp and regal against the fading light. Dash didn't try to hide, but he didn't approach either. He took a seat at a table about 20 feet away, lighting his cigarette with a steady hand. She didn't look over, but he knew she felt his presence. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the unspoken. For a long, silent minute, the only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocks far below. Finally, she turned her head. Her expression was unreadable, the evening shadows playing across her features. She looked at him not with the sharpness of the earlier confrontation, but with a strange, contemplative curiosity. She lifted her glass in a slow, silent salute, a gesture that could have been an invitation or a warning. Dash inclined his head, raising his own cigarette in a mirroring gesture of acknowledgement. It was a quiet, dangerous moment of truce, acknowledging that the game was set, and the players were both ready. She turned back to the sea, and Dash finished his cigarette, his mind already calculating the remaining hours of the night. She knew he was a player, he knew she was a shark, but at 8:00 a.m., they were both going to be in the same room, and the game would finally turn from words to action. Then she walked over and stood opposite of Dash. "Tell me, Mr. Stone, what brought you to this line of work?" Dash hadn't thought to make up a backstory to Richard Stone. If he hesitates, he gives himself away. If he says something wrong, the charade is over. "My father was the curator of a museum in New York. I was brought into the family business and found that I have an inherited skill for this line of work. The art is for the money. The real perks of the job are the fascinating people I encounter, such as yourself," Dash says. "How about you?" By the accent, I'm guessing Stockholm, but with the refinement of a finishing school in Paris. The Duchess pulled out the chair opposite him, the metal legs scraping softly against the stone terrace. She sat with a fluid, predatory grace, setting her glass down without a sound. Her eyes, blue and piercing, locked onto his, searching for the slightest tremor of deceit. "A family business," she mused, her voice a low, melodic purr. "How very traditional. Though, if I recall, your father was known for a rather conservative approach to the trade. He stayed behind desks. You, Richard, seem to prefer the front lines." Dash didn't flinch. He let a thin, self-deprecating smile touch his lips, the look of a son who had outgrown his father's shadow. "My father lived for the prestige. I live for the chase. I found that if one stays behind a desk, one only ever sees what people choose to sell. If you want the truth of a piece, you have to go where it hides." He took a slow drag of the cigarette he just lit, his gaze steady, almost bored. "But you didn't answer my question. Stockholm, perhaps? Or have the years of traveling made your origins as elusive as your collection?" The Duchess leaned forward, the moonlight catching the diamond pendant at her throat. She didn't blink. She played with the stem of her wineglass, her movements calculated. "I was born in Stockholm, yes," she said, her tone dropping, turning the conversation into a private theater. "But you are right about Paris. It was there that I learned that names are just labels, and origins are just myths we tell ourselves so we don't feel quite so lost in the world." She tilted her head, her gaze drifting over his face as if she were reading the fine print of a contract. "You talk about art as if it were a weapon, Mr. Stone. Most of your peers view it as an investment. You view it as a conquest. It makes me wonder, when you look at a piece like the one I've promised to show you tomorrow, are you truly looking at the brushwork, or are you looking for the weakness in the frame?" Dash laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that seemed to hang in the cool night air. "I look for a return on investment, Duchess. Don't romanticize my greed. It's the only thing that's kept me in this suite and out of the poorhouse." He leaned in, mirroring her posture, closing the gap between them until the scent of her perfume, jasmine and something sharper, like ozone, filled his senses. "But tell me," he said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, Since we're being honest about our inheritances, if you had to choose between the art and the chase, if the painting were to disappear tomorrow, would you be a woman who mourns the loss, or a woman who is already planning the next hunt? The Duchess stared at him, and for the briefest of moments, the mask of the aristocratic collector slipped. Her eyes went hard, ancient, and entirely devoid of warmth. "I never mourn, Mr. Stone," she replied softly. "I simply replace." She stood up abruptly, the movement elegant and final. She didn't offer a hand, nor a pleasantry. She just looked down at him, faint, dangerous smile playing on her lips. 8:00 a.m., don't be late. I hate waiting for my guests, and I have very little patience for those who fail to show up for their own demise. With that, she turned and walked away into the shadows of the garden, leaving Dash alone with his cigarette and the lingering, cold realization that he had just played a hand against a player who knew exactly what the stakes were. Dash didn't follow the Duchess. He waited until her silhouette vanished into the hotel's side entrance before he crushed his cigarette under his heel. He didn't head back to his suite. Instead, he took the long way around, cutting through the darkened service yard, his movements becoming fluid and silent. He kept to the shadows, his eyes constantly scanning the hotel's upper balconies and the perimeter wall. The guard he'd spotted in the casino was likely still roaming, and the Duchess's warning, demise, rang in his ears with uncomfortable clarity. She knew he was a wolf. He just had to make sure he was the one doing the hunting. He reached the rusted service door and tapped the signal. Hans opened it instantly, his face tight with concern. "You've been gone for hours. I was about to signal a burnout." "Not yet," Dash said, slipping into the maintenance corridor and shutting the door behind him. "But we're on a tighter leash than I thought." He moved to the light of the lamp, his face serious. "I have the appointment. 8:00 a.m. at the administrative gate. She's showing me the Prague piece herself." Hans let out a low whistle, his shoulders dropping just an inch. "That's the opening, then. But you don't look like you just won the lottery." "She's smarter than V's intel suggested," Dash said, pacing the small, cramped space. "She didn't just buy the act. She scrutinized it. She knows I'm not just a curator, and she knows I'm here for something specific. She didn't call me a thief, but she looked at me like she was measuring me for a shroud." Dash recounted the conversation, the questions about his father, and the Duchess's chilling comment about replacing things rather than mourning them. "She's cold, Hans," Dash finished. "If I trip up once tomorrow morning, there won't be a negotiation. She'll have me erased before the breakfast service." Hans didn't look comforted, but he reached under the table and pulled out a small metallic object, a bypass key for the type of high-security tumbler common in these administrative vaults. "I managed to source this from the local contact. It's a skeleton shim. It won't get you through an electronic deadbolt, but if the secondary vault is mechanical, it'll buy you an extra 10 seconds. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But be careful. She's already suspicious. If you try to lift that piece before the gavel drops, you're not just a thief, you're a diplomatic incident." Dash took the shim, the cold steel feeling heavy and final in his palm. He looked back at the map, tracing the route from the hotel lobby to the administrative wing. "I'm not lifting it yet," Dash said, his voice hardening. "She's not stupid. If the piece vanishes before the auction, the whole house goes into lockdown. The auction needs to happen. It provides the cover of crowds, the noise of the bidding, and the inevitable movement of high-value items that will mask the theft." "Then what's the move for 8 a.m.? Hans asked. "Information," Dash replied. "I need to confirm the security protocols for the final move. I need to know exactly how they bypass the electronic locks when they transfer the piece from the holding room to the ballroom floor. If I can see the bypass, I can replicate the signal." He traced a line on the blueprint. "She thinks she's vetting me to see if I'm a high roller. She's going to show me the piece to prove she has the goods, which means she'll have to disarm the alarm to get me into the holding room. That is my window." "You want to tag it," Hans realized, his eyes widening. "Exactly. I'll switch the microfilm on the frame or the crate while she's busy bragging about its provenance. Once it's switched, we sit back and watch the show. Dash looked at Hans, a grim, sharp edge to his smile. She thinks she's inviting a buyer into her inner circle. She's actually letting the wolf into the cage to sacrifice the lamb. We let the auction start. We let the bidding drive the room crazy. And if she catches you switching the microfilm, then I'm just an eccentric buyer with a habit of getting too close to his acquisitions, Dash said, shrugging. I'll play the role of the obsessed collector, checking the authenticity of the piece. He turned toward the door, his expression unreadable. Pack the gear, Hans. We have a show to attend. Chapter 6. The suite was still shrouded in the pre-dawn gloom, the only light the faint, rhythmic pulse of the city outside. Dash sat at the small writing desk, his movements economical and precise. He had the decoy, a strip of microfilm containing a recipe for a different regional French sauce, taped to the inside of his watchband. He checked his reflection one last time. Richard Stone was a man who moved with a careless, wealthy arrogance. He practiced the slouch, the slight tilt of the chin, the bored gaze. He looked like a man who bought art to fill empty wall space in a home he rarely visited. He didn't need to be a genius. He just needed to be convincing. At 7:55 a.m., he left the suite. He moved through the hotel's service corridors, the carpet muffling his footsteps. When he reached the administrative wing, the air changed. The scent of expensive floor wax gave way to the sterile, ozone-sharp tang of high-security archives. The Duchess was waiting at the heavy, steel-reinforced gate. She stood beside a massive, nervous-looking facility manager who held a heavy keyring like a holy relic. She was dressed in sharp, uncompromising charcoal, a stark contrast to the opulence of the hotel lobby. She turned as Dash approached, faint, serpentine smile touching her lips. Mr. Stone, I see the sunrise didn't deter you. It's a long walk for a mediocre painting, Duchess, Dash said, his voice light, carrying the perfect amount of dismissive boredom. I trust the view in the vault is better than the one in the lobby. It is a view of history, she replied. She nodded to the manager, who fumbled the keys into the lock. The heavy tumblers groaned, a sound of grinding metal that seemed to vibrate in Dash's marrow. Though, I suspect your definition of history is as shallow as your bank account. The vault was cavernous, and the temperature was kept at a precise, bone-chilling constant. The painting sat on the easel, illuminated by a single, focused halogen lamp. It was a modest, dark-toned portrait. A young boy in ragged clothes, clutching the collar of a mangy, wide-eyed terrier. The brushwork was crude, almost amateur, and the subject was entirely unremarkable. A portrait of a boy and his dog, Dash said, his voice echoing in the small space. He walked around the easel, his hands clasped behind his back, forcing his heart rate to remain steady. I've seen 1,000 of these in the basements of provincial galleries. Why this one? Why is it the centerpiece of your collection? The Duchess didn't move. She stood near the vault door, her arms folded, watching his every movement with the intensity of a hawk. It isn't the artistry that gives it value, Richard. It is the history. The boy was a ghost, a forgotten witness to a crime that even now would topple governments. Dash stopped, feigning fascination. A crime? It looks like a study in poverty. It is a study in secrets, she corrected, her voice dropping. The boy saw something he shouldn't have. He was painted by his father before they disappeared into the night. That canvas has been passed through the hands of kings, revolutionaries, and now the most powerful men in Moscow want it. They aren't just buying a portrait. They are buying the history hidden within it. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over the canvas. Tell me, Richard. You claim to have the eye of an expert. You have the provenance. Tell me why, if this boy is so insignificant, he is worth the price of a private island? Dash realized the trap. If he didn't give her an answer that satisfied her, she would keep him here, watching, or worse, she'd inspect the frame herself. The eyes, Dash said, stepping back into her personal space, his eyes locked on hers, not the painting. The boy isn't looking at the painter. He's looking at the person behind the painter. There's a specific kind of fear in his expression, not of the artist, but of the world outside the frame. That's the secret, isn't it? He's the witness, and he's terrified. The Duchess leaned in, her gaze flickering to the painting. You have a dark imagination, Mr. Stone. I have a realistic one, Dash said. He moved toward the easel, reaching out as if to brush a speck of dust from the frame. Is it really worth the risk to let the Russians see it? If the crime is as dangerous as you say, they'll want to bury it, not own it. They want to control it, she whispered. This was it. She was looking at the boy's eyes, lost in her own explanation. Dash moved. He reached for the frame, his fingers sliding behind the wood. Clack! His fingernail caught the edge of the adhesive, but the bond was older, stickier than he'd anticipated. He pulled, but the binding held firm, the wooden stretcher creaking under the pressure. The Duchess stiffened, her head snapping toward him. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice sharpening. Dash didn't look at her. He exerted more pressure, his heart hammering against his ribs. The seal started to peel, but a loud, sharp snap of the dry, brittle wood echoed through the vault like a gunshot. The Duchess took a predatory step forward, her hand moving toward the small, concealed panic button by the door. What did you do? Dash didn't hesitate. He pulled his hand away, holding the decoy microfilm, already prepped with a thin adhesive, between his index finger and thumb. He slammed his hand against the back of the frame, pressing the decoy into place with a violent, jarring force. He spun around, forcing a look of panicked embarrassment, holding his hands up. I thought there was a hairline crack in the wood. I leaned on it too hard. I'm sorry, Duchess. I've always had a clumsy streak when I'm nervous. The Duchess arched an eyebrow, her lip curling in disdain. Nervousness is a luxury the truly expert cannot afford, Mr. Stone. He stood perfectly still, his breath hitched, his hand vibrating slightly in his pocket, where the real microfilm sat, burning against his skin. The Duchess stood 3 feet away, her eyes boring into him. She looked at his hands, then at the frame, then back to his eyes. The silence stretched for an agonizing 10 seconds. She walked toward the easel, her hand reaching out to inspect the back of the frame herself. Dash's blood ran cold. If she touched the binding, if she felt the edges, he was a dead man. He watched her fingertips touch the seal, but finding the adhesive undisturbed made her stop. She pulled her hand back, the tension in her shoulders diffusing, though her gaze remained frigid. She smoothed the front of her jacket, regaining her composure with a terrifying speed. Dash tucked his hands into his pockets, his fingers curling tightly around the real microfilm. It felt small, fragile, and heavier than lead. He forced his breathing to remain slow and rhythmic. The image of the boy in the painting, that terrified, wide-eyed witness, serving as a cold anchor for his nerves. If this painting has the history you say, my clients will pay top dollar for it, Dash said, maintaining the arrogant, bored veneer of Richard Stone. I hope your Russian friends come prepared for a fight. The Duchess let out a low, humorless laugh. She turned away from him, walking back toward the heavy steel door. My Russian friends are not prone to fighting, Mr. Stone, she said, her voice reclaiming its melodic, predatory purr. They are prone to erasing. If you think the auction is a mere scuffle, you have vastly underestimated the stakes. She stopped at the threshold and looked back over her shoulder, the vault's harsh lighting casting deep, skeletal shadows across her features. I have a busy morning ahead, she said. I trust you can find your own way out? I'd hate for you to get lost in the service tunnels. They can be so very unforgiving to those who don't belong there. It was a warning, sharp and clear. She knew he'd been wandering, and she knew the service tunnels were his path of least resistance. I have an excellent sense of direction, Dash replied, his tone light. And I never get lost when I know exactly what I'm looking for. We shall see, she said. She stepped out into the hall, the manager closing the door behind her with a final echoing thud. Dash remained in the vault for a beat longer, listening to the fading click of her heels on the polished stone floor. He didn't waste a second. He turned and headed for the emergency exit, hidden behind the secondary climate control unit. He had the microfilm, the decoy was in place, and the Duchess was walking toward an auction that was about to turn into the most embarrassing and dangerous mistake of her career. He reached the maintenance corridor, the damp, cool air rushing to meet him. He pulled the real microfilm from his pocket, holding it up to the dim light. It was just a sliver of plastic, but it was the only thing standing between Hans's sister and a shallow grave in Moscow. Dash made his way through the service stairs, his movements fluid and unhurried. He was no longer the curator. He was simply a guest, wandering away from the morning rush, his mind calculating the distance between the vault and the public areas. He didn't head for his suite. It was the first place they would look if the Duchess sensed something was wrong. He emerged into the hotel lobby. It was a hive of early morning activity, staff polishing brass, guests waiting for carriages, the murmur of polished conversation. He stopped at the small kiosk near the entrance. He selected a postcard from the rack, a bright, saturated image of the hotel's cliffside terrace. He paid the clerk with a casual nod, his demeanor that of a bored traveler with time to kill. He leaned against the counter, uncapping a fountain pen. In a steady, unassuming hand, he wrote, "Having a great time. Wish you were here." He slipped the postcard into his breast pocket, the microfilm tucked safely within the heavy stock, and folded the card once neatly. It was a mundane scrap of paper that now held the fate of a dozen people in Moscow. He navigated toward the loading area, the smell of damp earth and sea salt growing stronger as he neared the service doors. The area was a chaotic hub of activity, with porters and kitchen staff moving crates in a frantic morning rhythm. Hans was there, hauling a heavy crate of crystal toward a delivery wagon. Dash timed his approach perfectly. He didn't stop, and he didn't whisper a word. He walked past the crate, brushing against Hans's arm with a clumsy, apologetic gesture. As they collided, the postcard moved from Dash's pocket to Hans's, a seamless transfer lost in the movement of the heavy load. "Pardon," Dash murmured, his voice maintaining the haughty tone of Richard Stone. Hans didn't look up, just muttered a rough, accented curse at the clumsy guest, his hand instinctively patting his coat pocket to ensure the card was secure. Dash continued out the rear doors and into the garden, putting space between himself and the hotel. He reached the edge of the cliff, looking down at the crushing surf below. He was empty-handed now, the burden gone, but the danger was just beginning. He found a spot beneath the shade of the cypress trees where he could watch the side entrance of the administrative wing. He pulled a cigarette from his case, lighting it with a steady hand. He had the best seat in the house to watch the Duchess walk into her own ruin. Dash flicked the spent match over the cliff edge, watching it tumble into the churning water below. The air felt heavy, and the reality of his position settled in. He wasn't leaving. If he vanished now, the Duchess would immediately suspect the curator who spent 10 minutes alone with her prize. He had to play the part of Richard Stone for another 24 hours. He turned back toward the hotel, his expression settling into the familiar, bored mask. He had to be seen. He had to be at lunch. He had to be at the bar. He had to be exactly where a man like Stone would be, all while knowing that the very foundation of the Duchess's power and the lives of the people in Moscow depended on the slow, methodical transit of a postcard through the regional mail system. He walked back through the side gardens, the midday sun catching the limestone facade of the hotel. He spotted the Duchess on the terrace, flanked by two men in heavy dark overcoats, the Russian advance team. They were talking, their gestures sharp and territorial. Dash adjusted his silk tie and continued his stroll, choosing a path that took him within earshot of the terrace before veering toward the front entrance. He didn't need to hear their words, The tension in the Duchess's posture was enough. She wasn't just selling a painting. She was securing a future, and she looked entirely confident. She had no idea that her key was currently sitting in Hans's pocket, destined for a mailbox in the village, or that the painting she was about to present was a culinary reference guide. He reached the grand lobby, the cool, polished marble a stark shift from the humid gardens. He stopped at the concierge desk, not because he needed anything, but because it was a perfect vantage point. He lit another cigarette, watching the flow of guests. He had 24 hours to kill in a building filled with people who would kill him if they knew what he'd done. He had to maintain the charade, keep his nerve, and wait for the auction to begin. Chapter 7. The air in the hotel bar was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the low hum of jazz. Dash sat in a corner booth, nursing a gin and tonic, watching the room through the reflection in his glass. Then he saw her. She was leaning against the mahogany bar, laughing at something the bartender had said. She was undeniably French, messy, elegant, and vibrant. She moved through the room with the casual confidence of someone who owned the air she breathed. She caught his eye. She didn't look away. She smiled, raised her glass in a silent toast, and walked over. "You look like a man who is waiting for something," she said, sliding into the booth without waiting for an invitation. "And from the look on your face, it isn't the auction." Dash leaned back, letting the Richard Stone persona settle over him like a tailored coat. "I'm waiting for the evening to improve. I found that the company in this hotel is usually as dull as the decor." She laughed, a low, throaty sound. "Then you clearly haven't been looking in the right places." Their conversation was effortless, a game of verbal sparring that hit all the right notes of attraction. Dash was playing the part, but for a moment, he actually enjoyed it. She was a thrill seeker, someone who lived for the tension of a moment, and she found his wealthy bored act irresistible. As they stood to leave, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. The Duchess entered, flanked by her usual retinue. She stopped dead when she saw them. She watched as Dash, the man who had spent the morning in her private, heavily guarded vault, the man who had brushed off her own calculated, cold invitations, was now laughing, his arm lightly draped around the waist of a local girl who had no business being in his world. The Duchess's eyes narrowed. It was a brief, sharp flash of irritation, a flicker of pure, unadulterated jealousy. She had tried to cultivate him, to pull him into her orbit, and here he was, choosing a faceless local girl instead. Dash caught the look. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply turned his back, guiding the girl toward the grand staircase. "The bar's far too public," Dash murmured, his voice smooth. "My suite has a view of the cliff, and the wine is significantly better." She grinned, a mischievous, sparkling look. "Lead the way, Mr. Stone." They walked up the stairs, leaving the Duchess standing in the middle of the lobby, her grip tightening on her clutch. She watched them all the way to the landing, the pride in her posture momentarily shaken. Once they were inside his suite, the atmosphere shifted. It was an opulent space, all high ceilings and velvet curtains, with a balcony that overlooked the dark, churning expanse of the sea. Dash shut the door and turned, shedding the heavy weight of the last 24 hours. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the thrill seeker was waiting, her eyes bright with the promise of the experience. "You're not like the others here," she said, moving toward him, her hands finding the buttons of his jacket. "You have a dangerous stillness about you." Dash let her pull him closer, the mask of Richard Stone held firmly in place. He was in the lion's den, currently engaged in the most reckless flirtation of his life. "Maybe that's because I'm not a tourist," Dash replied, his eyes dark with the challenge. It was difficult to try to maintain the Stone character when she let her dress fall to the floor. The sunlight danced across her small breasts. Dash spent the next hour in the embrace of the girl. The lovemaking was soft at first, then turned into animalistic fucking, It became less of a mutual experience and more an exhibition of skills. She was skilled. It was the first time since arriving that Dash could be Dash. When they both had reached the peak of the rapture, they lay there, covered in sweat, smoking a cigarette. The curtains were drawn against the midday light, leaving the suite in a soft golden amber. The scent of jasmine clung to the linens, mingling with the salt air drifting in from the balcony. It had been an evening of sharp edges and sudden, frantic heat. A rare, visceral release after the crushing tension of the vault. She sat on the edge of the bed, her movements graceful as she reached for her stockings. She looked at Dash, who was propped up against the headboard, his eyes tracing the shadows of the room. She looked satisfied, a faint, lingering smile on her lips. "You are a strange man, Richard," she whispered, leaning over to brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "You have the hands of a man who builds empires, but the eyes of someone who is always looking for the exit." Dash watched her, the mask of the arrogant curator slipping back into place, cool and impenetrable. "I'm a man who appreciates a view, nothing more." She laughed, a soft musical sound that filled the room. She stood, smoothing her dress, and leaned down to press a lingering kiss to his shoulder before turning toward the door. She paused by the nightstand, her hand dipping into her small, beaded purse. Dash watched with lazy interest, thinking she was looking for a lipstick or a mirror. Instead, she pulled out a thick stack of franc notes, neatly folded. She placed them on the mahogany surface with a deliberate, appreciative tap. "For your time," she murmured, a twinkle of amusement in her eyes. "I know how hard it is to keep a man like you entertained when he's so desperately bored." She blew him a kiss, slipped out the door, and clicked it shut behind her. Dash stared at the money. He sat there for a long moment, the silence of the room amplifying the absurdity of the situation. He was a deep-cover operative, a man currently orchestrating the collapse of a high-stakes operation, a man whose life was measured in inches and seconds, and he had just been tipped like a hotel employee. He picked up the stack of bills, fanning them out with a dry, ironic laugh. "You gigolo," he muttered to the empty air, shaking his head. He climbed out of bed, the reality of his situation returning with the cool air of the room. He walked to the window and looked out at the lights of the hotel gardens below. He had the money, he had the secret, and he had the target. The Duchess was still downstairs, likely stewing over his choice of company, and the auction was only hours away. He tucked the francs into his jacket pocket. He'd have to find a way to donate them to a local charity or use them to bribe a waiter later, and began to dress. He wasn't just Dash McCall anymore. He was Richard Stone, the most expensive and now, apparently, most sought-after companion in the south of France. The afternoon heat of the Riviera was heavy, pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the suite. Dash had showered, dressing in a fresh shirt that felt crisp against his skin, the lingering scent of jasmine on his clothes the only evidence of the last hour. He'd left the stack of francs on the dresser, a silent mocking tip for the gigolo, and headed for the lobby, his mind perfectly clear, the adrenaline of the tryst replaced by the cold focus of the mission. He hadn't expected to find her waiting. The Duchess was standing near the center of the lobby, alone. Her posture was rigid, her gloved hands clenched so tightly at her sides that the fine leather groaned. When she saw him, her gaze locked onto him with a predatory intensity that bypassed any professional pretense. She wasn't looking at him like a man she was trying to manipulate. She was looking at him like a man who had betrayed her. "I trust your afternoon was productive," she said, her voice dripping with venom. The melodic purr was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged edge. "I didn't realize your tastes ran toward common street whores, Mr. Stone." Dash tilted his head, feigning a look of polite, bored confusion. "I'm a man who enjoys the local color, Duchess. Surely you don't begrudge a guest a little diversion." "Diversion?" She took a step toward him, her composure fraying. I invited you into my room. I offered you a place at my table, and you choose to spend your hours with a girl who wouldn't know the difference between a masterpiece and a parlor print. She was leaning into him now, ignoring the curious glances of the hotel staff nearby. The jealousy had stripped away her caution. She was no longer the mastermind, but a woman stung by a rejection she clearly wasn't accustomed to. She was charming, Dash said, his tone infuriatingly light. Sometimes, the simplest things are the most refreshing. The Duchess let out a sharp, breathless laugh, devoid of humor. Is that what you think this is? A game? You think you can treat me like an afterthought and walk away unscathed? She reached out, her hand lashing out to grab his lapel. Her grip was desperate, her knuckles white. The Russians are coming for the final viewing. If you think your little tryst will distract you from the gravity of what is on that canvas, you are a fool. Dash stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers. He saw it all. The lack of discipline, the way her eyes darted to the lobby doors to see if anyone was watching, the slight involuntary tremor in her hands. She was sloppy, she was angry, and in her rage, she was exposing just how much she relied on the perceived value of that painting to maintain her own standing. I'm well aware of the stakes, Duchess, Dash said, his voice dropping to a low, cold register that wasn't Richard Stone at all. But you seem to be the one losing your grip. He reached up, gently but firmly prying her fingers from his jacket. As he pulled her hand away, he felt the dampness of her palm. She was sweating. The auction is tomorrow, Dash continued, reverting instantly to Stone's bored drawl. I suggest you take a deep breath. You're starting to look like someone who is afraid the prize is already lost. He didn't wait for her reply. He kissed her on the cheek, then stepped around her, his shoulder brushing hers with a deliberate, casual arrogance that made her flinch. As he walked toward the terrace, he felt her eyes boring into his back, a glare that held enough hate to light a fire. He had broken her composure. He had shifted the dynamic from a professional standoff to a personal vendetta. Perfect. She spun on her heel, her movements sharp and impulsive, and caught him just before he reached the heavy, brass-handled doors of the lobby. She didn't use a guard or a threat. She used her own body, stepping directly into his path with a force that took even Dash by surprise. No man walks away from me, she hissed, the words vibrating against his chest. Before he could offer a witty retort or slide back into the safety of his persona, she reached up, her gloved hands locking behind his neck with a desperate, ironclad grip. She pulled him down, her mouth crushing against his. It wasn't the practiced, seductive kiss he had expected, and it was possessive, hungry, and dangerously undisciplined. It tasted of expensive brandy and raw, unchecked fury. Dash went rigid for a split second, his mind flashing to the tactical reality. The lobby was full of staff and early afternoon guests. But he caught himself. He melted into the kiss, his hands coming up to rest firmly on her waist, his thumbs pressing into the small of her back. He had to play the part of the man who was just arrogant enough to return a duchess's unwanted affection. He pulled back just an inch, his eyes dark, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Careful, Duchess, he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. You're making quite a scene for a woman who prides herself on discretion. She breathed heavily, her eyes wide, the pupils blown. The public display had shocked her back into a semblance of awareness. But the damage was done. The red flush on her cheeks and the frantic rise and fall of her chest were impossible to hide from the room. She had just laid herself bare in the middle of the hotel, and she knew it. She released him, stepping back as if burned. She smoothed her hair, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists to hide it. The auction, she managed to say, her voice cracking before she regained her predatory purr. Don't be late, Mr. Stone. I would hate for you to miss the moment your reputation is destroyed. She turned and marched toward the elevators, not looking back. Dash stood in the center of the lobby, the taste of her kiss still sharp on his lips. He adjusted his silk tie, his face wiped clean of all emotion. He had achieved the ultimate distraction. He had made her care, and in doing so, he had ensured that when the auction began, she would be watching him. Not the painting, not the microfilm, and certainly not the security of her own empire. He turned toward the terrace, his pace slow, his heart rate steady. He had won the day. Now all he had to do was survive the night. Chapter 8. The suite felt like a pressure cooker now, the air heavy with the aftermath of their confrontation. Dash didn't even have to lock the door behind him. He knew she would follow. She wasn't an aristocrat anymore. She was a woman hunting for a victory she couldn't articulate. When the knock came, he didn't check the peephole. He knew the rhythm. Sharp, insistent, demanding. He opened the door to find Ingrid standing there. She hadn't bothered to change. The same charcoal suit from the vault, the same blood-red nails, but her eyes were wilder now. The veneer of the Duchess stripped away to reveal something far more volatile. "Shouldn't you be preparing for the auction?" Dash asked, leaning against the doorframe, his voice perfectly modulated to that bored, untouchable register of Richard Stone. "Shouldn't you be meeting your Russian friend?" She pushed past him, her scent, expensive, cold, and now sharpened by nervous adrenaline, filling the space. "Petrovsky arrives from Moscow on the 10 o'clock flight tonight," she said, her voice low and tight. "I have plenty of time. For now, you're mine. I said no man walks away from me, especially not an arrogant American art dealer." She paced the length of the room, her gaze darting, finally landing on the dresser. Her eyes narrowed as they fixed on the thick stack of francs the girl had left as a tip for his services earlier that afternoon. She walked over, picking up the bills, her fingers tracing the paper with a mocking intensity. "If that is what you truly are," she whispered, a cruel, knowing smile twisting her lips. Dash didn't flinch. He walked over, pouring himself a drink from the sideboard, the ice clinking against the crystal with a steady, infuriating rhythm. "Oh, that," he said, gesturing vaguely at the money with his glass. "I cleaned out my pocket when I got back to the room. That much cash makes a man feel unbalanced." She turned to face him, the wad of francs crushed in her fist. She was vibrating with a mixture of rage and raw, unvarnished hunger. She didn't want the auction. She didn't want the Russians. She wanted the man who had looked at her with indifference and dared to treat her like a backdrop. Dash stood his ground, the cold, calculated operative hidden beneath the silk shirt of the curator. He had played the situation perfectly. He had triggered her ego, and now here she was, coming to him in the final critical hours, distracted, desperate, and entirely off balance. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes meeting hers. "You're making a mistake, Duchess. You have a reputation to maintain, an auction to win." She moved toward him, her stride predatory. "I have everything I need right here." Dash watched her approach, his heart rate steady. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he knew exactly how it would end. She thought she was taking back her power. She had no idea she was handing him the final piece of his mission. She leaped at him with the predatory elegance of a tiger, her fingers tearing at his silk collar with a force that threatened to unravel the entire garment. "Easy with the buttons, Duchess," Dash murmured, his voice steady despite the sudden violence of her advance. "This is an expensive shirt." She didn't answer. Her eyes were dark, burning with a frantic need to dominate, to claim, to possess. She shed her dress in a single fluid motion, the silk pooling at her feet. The late afternoon sun, bleeding through the balcony doors, showered her body in an amber radiance, a stark, beautiful contrast to the raw hunger in her expression. She was beautiful, she was dangerous, and she was completely off base. Dash felt a flicker of genuine excitement. Usually, the chase was his to command, the rhythm his to dictate. He enjoyed being the one pursued, especially by a woman who commanded an empire, but had forgotten how to command herself. But there was nothing soft about this encounter. There was no room for tenderness. She had a point to prove, a wounded ego to soothe through dominance. So did he. He was still feeling the weight of the earlier hour, the lingering physical toll of his morning. But he dug deep. He wasn't about to let her win this battle of will or stamina. It became a grueling, silent war of attrition. 1 hour bled into 2, the shadows in the room lengthening until they were nothing but silhouettes moving against the dying light. When they finally broke apart, both were left gasping, collapsed in a tangle of limbs and damp linen, utterly spent. There was no clear winner. They lay in the heavy silence, chests heaving, the air in the room thick with the scent of jasmine and spent adrenaline. Dash had known women in every corner of the map, from the back alleys of Cairo to the high society ballrooms of London. But he had to concede. The Duchess was an anomaly. She had impressed him, not just with her fervor, but with the sheer, unbridled depth of her unraveling. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9, a deep, resonant chime that cut through the silence. She moved then, her movements sluggish but precise. She redressed in silence, not looking at him, pulling the mask of the aristocrat back over her skin as if it were a physical garment. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the brass knob. She looked back at him, her hair slightly disheveled, the only sign of the war they had just waged. "The auction starts in 12 hours, she said, her voice strained, struggling to reclaim its icy composure. "Get some rest, Mr. Stone. You will need it." She slipped out the door, the click of the latch echoing in the quiet suite. Dash lay back against the pillows, staring up at the intricate molding of the ceiling. A slow, smug, and deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. He had done more than just survive the encounter. He had broken her. Beneath the veneer of power and the title of Duchess, he had found the woman underneath. A woman who was now desperately, dangerously focused on him. He closed his eyes. The image of her unraveling already burned into his memory. 12 hours until the auction. The microfilm was on its way, the decoy was in the frame, and the woman who held the keys to the kingdom was currently stumbling back to her quarters, her mind clouded by everything but the danger standing right in front of her. He was ready. Dash dressed quickly, the silence of the suite now replaced by the cold, mechanical necessity of the next phase. He didn't look at the bed. He didn't look at the money. He stepped out of the hotel and into the cool night air, where Gus was waiting in the shadows of a nondescript sedan. The drive to the outskirts of the airfield was quiet. They left the car and trekked up a jagged, brush-covered hill, the wind whipping around them. Below, the private strip was bathed in the harsh glare of halogen floods. A sleek jet touched down, its engines whining as it taxied to a stop. A man stepped out, a brute of a man, wide-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing a suit that looked like it had been pulled off a rack in a hurry. He moved with a heavy rhythmic gait that spoke of broken noses and gutter fights. "You would think they would send someone that looks the part," Dash remarked, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. Gus adjusted his binoculars, his expression grim. "He is here to buy a painting. For all they know, he is redecorating the Kremlin." Dash shifted his weight, his eyes tracking the Russian as he was greeted by a nervous-looking aide from the hotel. "Did you get my letter home sent off?" "It should be arriving about the time you do," Gus murmured, not looking at him. "If you don't plan any pit stops. You play a dangerous game, McCall. The word about the jealousy of the Duchess is already the talk of the casino." Dash offered a thin, mirthless smile. "Good. Let them see the little Swedish girl she truly is. After the auction, she will never get a job like this again." Gus finally lowered the binoculars, turning to look at him, his face etched with disapproval. "If the Russians don't kill her first." If the Russians don't kill her, Dash echoed, his tone clinical. Gus let out a sharp, scoffing breath. What a luxury it must be to be able to throw away women like that. Dash froze, his eyes locking onto Gus's. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unwanted. I'm not throwing her away, Gus. She knows the danger of the mission just as well as we do. It just happened she chose the wrong side of the fight. He turned back to the runway, watching the Russian get into a waiting car. He felt no remorse, only the sharp, focused edge of a man who knew exactly what the cost of his victory would be. The Duchess had played with fire, and she had tried to pull him into the flames. Now he was simply waiting to see how long she could endure the heat. Let's go, Dash said, his voice clipped. The auction is in the morning, and I want to be the first one through those doors. The suite was silent now, stripped of the chaotic energy of the afternoon. Dash walked through the rooms, the plush carpet deadening his footsteps. He felt the weight of the day, the heist, the roleplay, the tryst, and the cold, professional observation of the Russian's arrival settling into his shoulders. He moved to the sideboard, the crystal decanter catching the moonlight. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon, the amber liquid swirling against the glass, and stepped out onto the balcony. The Mediterranean air was cool and salt-crusted, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere. Lobby. He pulled a cigarette from his silver case, the strike of the match a sudden, bright flare in the dark. He sat in the wrought iron chair, leaning back as he watched the smoke curl upward, disappearing into the vast, ink-black canopy of the night. Below him, the sea was a rhythmic, dark pulse. The waves caught the moonlight in jagged silver veins, rolling endlessly against the rocks of the Riviera. It was a beautiful view, perhaps the most beautiful he'd seen in years of chasing shadows across borders. For a moment, he let the mask of Richard Stone slip entirely. He wasn't the arrogant curator, he wasn't the gigolo, and he wasn't the man who had systematically dismantled a woman's composure. He was just Dash McCall, an operative at the end of a long, jagged road, enjoying the kind of luxury he usually only saw through the lens of a mission briefing. He took a slow drag of the cigarette, the tobacco biting pleasantly at his throat. He thought about the letter Gus had sent, already winging its way toward home. He thought about the Russian, Petrosky, currently preparing for a fight he wouldn't even know he was in until it was too late. And he thought about the Duchess, likely pacing her own quarters, her pride shattered and her focus entirely on a man who was already 3 steps ahead of her. Everything was in place. The board was set. He tapped the ash over the railing and watched it vanish into the void. 12 hours left. Tomorrow the gavel would fall, the microfilm would be handled, and he would disappear into the night, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of Richard Stone and a broken woman in his wake. He finished the drink, the warmth spreading through his chest, and leaned his head back against the chair. He allowed himself one final moment of quiet before the storm broke, watching the sea, waiting for the dawn. Chapter 9. The auction house was a stifling cathedral of wealth, smelling of old varnish, expensive perfume, and the kind of desperation that only money can buy. Dash sat in the center of the 3rd row, his posture relaxed, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced boredom of a man who spent his life surrounded by masterpieces. He was Richard Stone again, draped in a charcoal suit, his face a mask of calculated indifference. 3 rows behind him, the Duchess sat like a queen on a throne, her eyes burning. She hadn't looked at him since the hotel, but he could feel her gaze, a physical weight pressing into his shoulder blades. She was watching him, not the stage. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like polished velvet, began the proceedings. Lot 42, a late Monet. The light, as you can see, is quite exquisite. Dash shifted, his paddle resting on his lap. He entered the fray early, a modest bid for a modest landscape. He was outbid quickly by a collector from Zurich. He didn't mind. He let a thin, charming smile touch his lips and leaned back, crossing his legs. He played the game, bidding on a minor sketch here, a frame there, losing them with the grace of a man whose bank account was bottomless, but whose interest was fickle. He was setting the rhythm. He was drawing the room's attention, making himself the most visible player in the house. The hours ticked by. The air grew thinner. Dash missed a Degas by a hair, letting out an audible sigh that made the woman beside him giggle. He was performing, and the room was eating it up. Finally, the auctioneer paused, adjusting his cuffs. A ripple of tension went through the room. Lot 89, the auctioneer announced, his voice dropping an octave. The centerpiece of our evening, the portrait of the boy and his dog. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and the painting was revealed. It was a masterpiece of shadow and light, a haunting, beautiful thing that seemed to hold a secret in its brushstrokes. Dash leaned forward. He saw Petrosky, the Russian he had watched from the hill, stiffening in his seat. The man looked completely out of place, his thick hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his eyes fixed on the canvas with a hunger that had nothing to do with art. We start the bidding at $2 million, the auctioneer said. Dash didn't hesitate. He raised his paddle. 2.2. Petrosky scowled and raised his own. 2.5. Dash caught the Russian's eye and gave him a lazy, arrogant wink. 3 million. The room went silent. The Duchess shifted in her seat behind him, the sound of her silk dress rustling like a snake in the grass. 3.2, Petrosky growled, his voice guttural. 4 million, Dash countered, his tone light almost dismissive. He was pushing it. He watched the Russian's face darken to a shade of purple, the man's knuckles white. Dash felt a thrill of adrenaline. But beneath it, a cold knot of anxiety began to tighten in his stomach. He was the agency's point man, but he was currently gambling with their operating budget as if it were play money. If the Russian stopped, if he called his bluff, Dash would be on the hook for $4 million he didn't have. He's not going to stop, Dash told himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. He has orders. He has to take it. 4.5 million, Petrosky shouted, the bid echoing off the high ceilings. Dash felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He raised his paddle again, his hand hovering for a second too long. 5 million. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the auctioneer looked shocked. Dash stood on the precipice, looking back at the Russian, who was now halfway out of his seat. For a terrifying, breathless second, Dash thought he had overplayed it. He thought the Russian was going to walk away, leaving him standing there, the winner of a painting that would ruin his cover and his career. Petrosky stared at him, his mouth twisted into a snarl. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he raised his paddle. 6 million, the Russian bellowed. Dash lowered his paddle. He held his gaze for a second, then allowed his shoulders to slump. He offered a tight, defeated nod, a picture of a man who had finally reached the limit of his vanity. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wood. Sold to the gentleman in the back for 6 million. Dash exhaled, the sound hidden by the murmur of the room. He had done it. He had forced the Russian to pay a ransom, not a price, and he had done it while keeping the target's eyes fixed entirely on himself. He leaned back, his face a mask of disappointment. But beneath the mask, a cold, sharp smile was waiting. The dance was over. The auction house felt suddenly claustrophobic, the heat of the room rising as the gavel struck for the final time. Dash sat slumped in his seat, successfully projecting the aura of a man who had been bested by a louder, richer, and far less tasteful opponent. The lot was smaller than the previous masterpieces, a quiet, melancholic work depicting a boy and his dog. It was a deceptively simple piece, but to the right eyes, its composition was perfect. Petrosky, the Russian, stood up immediately. He didn't look like a collector admiring a find. He looked like a thief who had just snatched his prize from a fire. He brushed past Dash's row, his heavy frame forcing people to scatter. He didn't even glance at the man who had just cost him millions. He was already focused on the handlers coming to retrieve the canvas. Dash remained seated, playing the part of the defeated bidder, his eyes fixed on the painting as it was carefully lifted from its stand. Then he felt it, a presence behind him that was colder than the air conditioning. He didn't have to turn around to know the Duchess was standing there. Her perfume, a sharp metallic floral, drifted over the back of his chair. "You are surprisingly poor at gauging your competition, Richard." Her voice came, cool and mocking, yet laced with a tremor of lingering rage. Dash stood slowly, smoothing his jacket with exaggerated care. He turned to face her. She was a vision of controlled fury, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the gigolo from yesterday, any sign of the man who had dared to hold her and then brush her aside. "Sometimes," Dash said, his voice dropping to that smooth, bored drawl, "I find that losing is more interesting than winning. It keeps the blood moving." The Duchess took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Is that what you tell yourself? You bid $6 million for a portrait of a boy and his dog, only to walk away like a pauper? You look desperate, Mr. Stone." She reached out, her gloved fingers resting momentarily on his lapel, a gesture that looked like an intimate caress to the room, but felt like a blade against his chest. "The Russians are ecstatic. You've made them very, very wealthy by inflating the market for their prize. They have the painting," Dash said, his eyes scanning the crowd to see if Petrovsky had already cleared the doors. "And I have the experience. Isn't that what the Riviera is for?" He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She was trying to read him, trying to decide if he was the fool he appeared to be or the threat she had instinctively sensed. But her jealousy, the primal, messy thing that had clouded her judgment all night, kept her focused on his motives rather than his mission. She was still looking for a romantic slight, not a cold-blooded heist. "You won't be back tomorrow," she whispered, her voice tightening, not as a command but as a realization. "I have seen all there is to see," Dash replied, tilting his head with a faint, enigmatic smile. He moved past her, his shoulder brushing hers with the same deliberate, arrogant indifference he had shown in the lobby. He didn't look back. He walked toward the exit, his pace measured, his pulse steady. Behind him he could hear the rustle of her silk, the sharp intake of breath. She was still standing there, watching him, her entire world narrowed down to the man walking away from her. He exited into the brilliant, blinding light of the afternoon. Petrovsky's black sedan was idling at the curb, the painting already being loaded into a secure, climate-controlled case in the trunk. Dash kept walking, heading toward the shadows of the garden. The game had been expensive, exhausting, and dangerously close. But it was finished. The microfilm was in the painting. The Russian was leaving with the decoy, and the Duchess was left with nothing but her own obsession. The transition from the garden to the private strip was a lesson in shadows. Dash didn't rush. He moved with the studied calm of a man who had already won, keeping his pace steady enough to blend into the evening crowd, but fast enough to outdistance any lingering surveillance. He reached the perimeter fence of the secondary airstrip, a small, gravel-streaked patch of land where his pilot, a man named Holloway, waited in the cockpit of a twin-engine light jet. There were no dramatics, no gunfire, and no bodies left in his wake. Just the cold, mechanical efficiency of an extraction that was already bought and paid for. Dash slipped through a gap in the chain link, his ears tuned for the heavy footfalls or the aggressive idling of a Russian sedan. He heard nothing but the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, low thrum of the French countryside. He climbed into the cabin, the door sealed shut with a pneumatic hiss, locking out the world he had just dismantled. "Status?" Holloway asked, not looking back. "Complete," Dash said, pulling off his tie and tossing it onto the seat beside him. "Let's get in the air." The plane taxied, the wheels crunching on the loose gravel before the engines roared to life, pushing him back into the leather upholstery. As they climbed, the lights of the Riviera began to shrink, a glittering, jeweled necklace of excess that he was now leaving far behind. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. He had spent the last 72 hours weaving a web of deceit, humiliation, and psychological warfare. And he had come away clean. The Russian would land in Moscow, secure in his victory, blissfully unaware that the painting in his cargo hold was the anchor that would eventually sink his entire operation, and the Duchess, the woman who had tried to play him and whom he had subsequently shattered, was now just a distant speck in the darkness. He felt no guilt. He had done his job with the clinical precision the agency demanded. Dash leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the moonlight play across the wing. He was headed home, his mind already shifting to the next briefing, the next objective. The mission was a total success. He closed his eyes, the image of the boy and his dog. That sentimental, perfect container for a devastating truth flickering behind his eyelids. He had won the game. He had played the cards exactly as they fell. But as the plane leveled out at 30,000 feet, Dash couldn't shake the sensation of a loose thread. He knew the Duchess. He knew that for all his breaking of her facade, he hadn't left her a path to crawl back to her old life. He had burned her bridges, and in his line of work, a woman with nothing left to lose was the only thing more dangerous than a man with a gun. He pushed the thought aside, the professional in him dismissing it as professional hazard. "Any issues?" Holloway asked over his shoulder. "None," Dash replied, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engines. "Clean break." He opened a leather portfolio, reviewing the mission parameters one last time to ensure he hadn't missed a single detail. He had achieved total victory. The asset was compromised, the target was led into the trap, and he was walking away with his hands clean. He allowed himself a brief, final glance back at the dark expanse of Europe below. The game had been played, the board cleared, and the pawn moved exactly where it needed to be. He was home free. Chapter 10. The jet didn't even fully cool down. As the engines began their slow, rhythmic whine of powering down, the tarmac was already humming with the approach of V's black sedan. Dash hadn't even stood up from his seat when the cabin door was pulled open from the outside. V stood at the base of the stairs, a monolith of impatience, with Gizmo trailing behind him, his thick spectacles catching the hangar lights and turning his eyes into unsettling, oversized orbs. "There is no point in getting off the plane, McCall," V barked, not bothering with a greeting. "You will only be here long enough to fuel and take off again." Dash stepped onto the top rung, feeling the phantom vibration of the flight still in his bones. He cracked a tired, smug grin. "A new mission already?" "I just got home, V. Besides, you should be happy. I ran that op clean. No explosions, no collateral, not even a single casing left behind. Hell, I didn't even get to shoot at anyone." Gizmo peered up at him, a nervous, jagged energy vibrating through his frame. "From the look on your face, I assume you still had a good time?" Dash winked at the technician. "You know it, Giz." "Enough!" V cut the air like a knife. "You need to go back." Dash froze, his boots hitting the tarmac. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a sharp, professional edge. "Go back? What the hell for?" "You are being sent back to extract the Duchess," V said, his voice flat. The Russians took a good look at that microfilm hidden on the back of the painting. "Recipes, honestly, McCall, you're a child." Dash's grin returned, wider than before. "I figured they might want to try something new in the Kremlin. A little French flair to brighten up the winter." V didn't blink. "They found it sooner than we hoped. The Duchess was supposed to be long gone before they realized the data was a decoy. Now, they have her tied up in a warehouse along the coast. You are to go in and rescue her. She is to come back here under the protection of the agency." Dash rubbed the back of his neck, the humor fading into a grim reality. "I doubt she will be too happy to see me, V. I left her in a state that doesn't usually inspire forgiveness." "It's better than dying," V snapped. Dash paused, a long, heavy silence falling between them as the fuel nozzle hummed in the distance. He looked at V, his eyes turning cold and dark. "Can I kill somebody this time?" V let out a sharp, audible sigh, shaking his head. I expect no less from you, McCall. What about blowing something up? Only if necessary, V said sharply, pointing a finger at him. Do not turn a rescue mission into a pyrotechnics display. Gizmo stepped forward, his hands trembling with a mix of anxiety and perverse pride. He held out a gold fountain pen, the metal gleaming dully in the artificial light. Take this. Use it sparingly. Dash took the pen, turning it over in his hand. It felt heavy, balanced like a weapon. What does it do? Be careful with it, Gizmo whispered, his pupils dancing behind his lenses. It has enough high-grade plastic explosive in the barrel to level a warehouse with one click. Triggers in the cap. It has a 2-minute delay. Click it. Throw it. Get the hell out of there. Dash slid the pen into his breast pocket, right over his heart. Speaking of pens, did you get the card I sent? V reached into his coat, his expression stony. It arrived this morning and was disposed of properly. Now get going, McCall. Time is a luxury neither you nor the Duchess currently possesses. Dash turned back toward the plane. The mission had changed. The game had moved from the velvet chairs of an auction house to the cold concrete floor of a Russian-held warehouse. He had gone from the man who broke the Duchess to the man who was now tasked with saving her from the consequences of his own success. He climbed back into the cockpit, the air inside already smelling of jet fuel and ozone. He didn't look at the horizon. He just hit the ignition, the engine screaming back to life, and began the long turn back toward the coast. The Mediterranean coast was a graveyard of jagged limestone and salt-crushed brush. Dash moved through the shadows with a quiet, lethal efficiency, stripped of the Richard Stone persona. He didn't move like a lounge lizard. He moved like a scalpel. He breached the warehouse with clinical violence, neutralizing the 2 guards at the rear entrance before they could even draw breath. He found the Duchess bound to a metal chair in the center of the floor. She looked wrecked, bruised, hair matted, her elegant clothes ruined. But the moment she heard his footsteps, her head snapped up. When she saw him, her eyes widened, not with relief, but with sharp, stinging contempt. You, she hissed, her voice raspy. How did you find me? Dash sliced the ropes with a combat knife, his movements focused and blunt. We're leaving. Wait, she pulled back, her face contorting in confusion as she looked at his tactical gear. The Russians, they took me because I was an asset. They wanted to squeeze for information on the auction. They think I know who you are. They think you were my plant. She stared at his silenced weapon, her confusion deepening into a mask of bewilderment. You're an art dealer, an ignorant, arrogant snob. You spent the last few days making an absolute spectacle of yourself at the auction. What is this? A sudden shout echoed from the main entrance. The guards had found the breach. Dash shoved the gold fountain pen into her hand, his grip firm. This isn't a pen, it's a timer. You click it once, you have 2 minutes. Exactly. Don't look back, don't stop, and don't ask any fucking questions. She stared at the gold object, her expression shifting from hatred to absolute confusion. You're insane. Click it, he commanded. She clicked. A faint, internal whirring began. A tiny, mechanical heartbeat. Run, Dash said. They sprinted toward the rear exit, the sound of heavy boots and gunfire erupting behind them. Dash fired back, his movements precise and lethal, a terrifying contrast to the man who had been sipping bourbon on a balcony 2 days ago. They burst out into the cool night air and scrambled down the rocky slope. They dove behind a limestone ridge just as the 2-minute mark hit. The warehouse didn't just burn, it disintegrated. A blinding, white-hot sphere of light erupted into the night sky, followed by a shockwave that rattled their very bones. Dash stood up, dusting off his gear, and checked his watch. He turned to look at the Duchess. She was sitting in the dirt, breathing hard, looking from the smoldering crater to the man who was calmly holstering his weapon. The realization hit her then, a physical blow that left her breathless. She began to laugh, a dry, brittle sound of pure self-loathing. "The way you move, the way you handled those men," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I spent 2 days patronizing you. I analyzed your gait, your drink order, your amateurish bidding strategy. I even felt sorry for you when you lost that painting." She looked down at her bruised hands, shaking her head. "I was looking for an art dealer, and I had the apex predator in the room. I feel like an absolute fool." Dash looked down at her. The art dealer mask was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened intensity that made the air feel heavy. "Richard Stone was a fun little act," he said, his voice stripped of the smooth, drawling cadence she knew. "I'm an operative, Duchess. The name is Dash McCall." The name landed like a guillotine. She stopped shivering, her expression freezing in sudden, sharp recognition. She had heard the name. In the shadow worlds, Dash McCall was whispered in backrooms. A man associated with impossible disappearances and state-level destabilizations. "McCall," she breathed. "You're the one who—" "Of course, it wasn't vanity. It was a setup." "I'm the man who's taking you home," Dash replied, clicking on his radio to signal the extraction team. "Under the protection of the agency, you have a lot to tell us about that microfilm, Duchess, and I suggest you start talking before we reach the extraction point." He turned away from her, already focusing on the next move, leaving her sitting in the dirt, finally realizing that the man who had played her at the auction wasn't a fool, but the most dangerous man she had ever met. They reached the designated extraction point, a secluded, fog-shrouded pier where a sleek, unmarked motor launch sat idling. Standing on the deck was Gus. He stepped onto the pier as they approached, his eyes flicking over the burning horizon and landing on the pair with intense professional relief. "I wanted to thank you, Dash," Gus said, his voice dropping the usual dry cynicism. He gestured toward the Duchess, who was still trembling from the shock of the blast. "My sister is safe. She's already being moved to a secure transport. She'll be back in the States by morning." Gus offered a sharp, singular nod of respect to Dash. "Au revoir, you dumb American." Dash took the offered hand, the grip firm. "Until next time, you Austrian prick." "I assume your jet is still at the secondary strip?" Gus asked, gesturing to the launch. "It's there," Dash replied. "The Russians are too busy sorting through the ashes of that warehouse to track a flight path." As they stepped onto the launch, the engine roared to life, cutting away from the pier and slicing through the dark water toward the airstrip where his jet waited. He didn't look back at the coastline. He had cleaned the board, recovered the asset, and ensured the secrets on that microfilm would remain buried. He found a seat near the stern, the cool mist of the Mediterranean hitting his face. The job was done. The Riviera was behind him. He closed his eyes, the roar of the boat's engine drowning out the ringing in his ears, and for the first time in days, he let his guard drop. The motor launch pulled alongside the light jet, the fuselage gleaming under the airport's harsh floodlights. The transition from the chaos of the warehouse to the sterilized, climate-controlled cabin of the aircraft felt like moving between two different worlds. Once the engines were screaming, pushing them into the black vault of the night sky, the cabin fell into a heavy, pressurized silence. Dash didn't go to the cockpit. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and walked to the back, where the Duchess sat, still staring at her own hands. He placed the glass in front of her. She looked at it, then up at him. The bruises on her face were dark, but her eyes were clear, colder than they had been at the auction, but devoid of the jagged rage from an hour ago. "You really are a bastard, aren't you, Dash McCall?" she said, her voice steady. Dash leaned against the bulkhead, watching the clouds streak past the wing. "That's what I've been told." "I was a fool," she said, taking a sip of the drink. I spent 3 days trying to read a man who wasn't there. I thought I was the one pulling the strings, and all the while, you were just waiting for me to walk into the web. You weren't the target, Dash said, his tone devoid of malice. The painting was. You were just the collateral I had to manage. She let out a short, hollow laugh. Collateral, I like that. It's honest. She paused, her gaze softening, losing its defensive edge. You saved me back there. You didn't have to trigger that pen. You could have left me in the fire. The agency wanted you alive, he replied, though the lie felt thin even to him. Is that all it was? She stood up, her movements fluid despite the pain. She stepped into his personal space, the scent of expensive perfume still lingering beneath the smell of smoke and salt water. She looked up at him, searching his face, not for the art dealer who had teased her on the balcony, but for the man who had walked through hell to bring her out. Dash didn't pull away. He didn't offer a charming smile or a deflection. He simply met her gaze, his expression unmasked, tired, sharp, and finally present. You're a shark, Duchess, he said quietly. In this business, that's the closest thing to a soul. She reached out, her hand resting briefly on his chest. Not a blade, not a caress, but an acknowledgement. The tension in the cabin shifted, the spy versus spy dynamic bleeding into something more complicated. A mutual recognition between two predators who had both been outplayed but had survived. We aren't friends, Dash, she murmured. No, he agreed, but we don't have to be enemies. He turned away to check the flight instruments, but as he moved, she caught his hand. It wasn't a demand, it was a pact. When we land, she said, tell me who I'm working for now. Dash looked back at her, the mask fully discarded. He gave a quick grin, then squeezed her hand, a brief, firm pressure that said everything needed to be said. When we land, Dash replied, we're on the same team. For now. He let go, turning back to the window. The lights of Europe were gone, swallowed by the ocean. Ahead, the Atlantic stretched out, vast and empty. He had his asset, he had his partner, and he had his mission. And love, it was something far more dangerous. It was an alliance.